No hyperspace signature registered. No ship dropped out of a lightspeed lane. No transponder pinged a Republic relay. No astromech flagged an anomaly on any scanner in the sector. Yet in the sky above the besieged mining world of Ordo Plutonia's neighbor, a rust-color husk of a planet called Devron's Reach, the fabric of space itself simply came apart. It did not explode. It did not flash. It tore the way old cloth tears, a seam splitting silently before the roar of wind rushes in to fill the gap. And through that seam fell something that had never been meant to fall through anything. The Clone Wars had been grinding across this system for 6 months. Devron's Reach mattered to no one strategically. A Tabana gas outpost, 3 settlements, a separatist garrison dug into the ridge above the largest one. But it mattered enormously to the 4,000 civilians who called it home, and to the Clone Battalion and Droid Legion currently trying to kill each other over it. This was, in other words, an ordinary corner of an increasingly ordinary war. Another rock, another body count, another line in a Republic casualty report that would be read by exactly no one with the power to end it. Third person is the vantage point this story will hold to throughout, not because any single perspective could contain what is coming, but because no single faction in this galaxy will get to own this story. The Jedi will not get to make it a parable about attachment. The Sith will not get to make it a parable about power. It will simply be what it is. The record of a philosophy from beyond the stars colliding with a galaxy that thought it had already seen the worst version of itself. The tear opened at 11,000 meters, directly above the ridge fighting. For 9 seconds it was visible to the naked eye as a bruised purple wound stitched across the sky, edges crackling with a light that had no business existing in real space. Clone troopers in the trenches below stopped firing. Battle droids, whose programming contained no subroutine for ignore the sky splitting open, simply froze, blaster rifles still raised, photoreceptors tilted upward. Something fell through the wound. It did not fall like debris. It fell with weight and intention, a shape too large and too deliberately proportioned to be wreckage. A figure, purple-skinned, armored in gold and violet plate, limbs the length of a Wookiee's, but corded with a density that made the eye recalculate its own sense of scale. It struck the ridge between the 2 dug-in armies with an impact that cratered 40 meters of rockcrete emplacement, and threw both a clone platoon and a droid squadron off their feet in the same instant, united for once in the same reflex, retreat. He rose from the crater without hurry. Thanos had crossed a boundary between universes precisely once before in his existence, and that crossing had been intentional, calculated, and armed. This one had been none of those things. He had been standing on Titan's ruined surface with a gauntlet fitted to his hand, attempting, against every warning his own instincts offered him, to bend the reality stone's power without the balance of the other 5. To reshape a single dying moon back into the garden it had been before his people destroyed it. A private indulgence he had permitted himself exactly once. The stone had answered his ambition by devouring the boundary between where he stood and where he did not belong. The gauntlet and every stone fitted to it had been torn from his hand in the instant the wound opened, flung somewhere into the dark between the tier's edges. He had followed them into the same dark, weightless, and unarmed, and arrived here, on a ridge, on a world he had never heard of, in a war that was not his, with nothing but his body and 40,000 years of certainty about what that body was for. He stood and took inventory, the way he always did, methodically, without panic. His strength was untouched. He could feel that immediately, the familiar readiness in every joint, the certainty that he could still crush stone with his hand or absorb a cannon blast without staggering. His mind was untouched, sharp and already cataloging. 2 armies, opposing colors, opposing insignia, both clearly disciplined, both clearly expendable to whatever commanded them from somewhere else. What was gone? And he understood this the instant he reached for it and found only absence, was the gauntlet, the stones. The instrument that had made a single act of his will equivalent to the judgment of a god. He was, for the first time in longer than he could easily calculate, simply Thanos again. No more, no less. And something in him, something old, something that predated the gauntlet entirely, recognized that this was not entirely a loss. The first shots came from the clone platoon, recovering their nerve faster than the droids did. A dozen blaster bolts converged on the crater. Thanos did not dodge them. He let 3 strike his shoulder and chest plate, watched the energy scatter uselessly off skin that had shrugged off worse from beings who could crack planets, and then closed the distance to the nearest trench line in 4 strides that covered what should have taken 20. What followed was not a battle. It was a demonstration, brief and almost incidental, of a fact the galaxy did not yet understand about itself, that its wars, its armies, its careful calculus of firepower and tactics had all been built against threats that bled the same way soldiers did. Thanos took the trench apart the way a man might clear a path through undergrowth, not with cruelty, not with the theatrical violence of a being enjoying itself, but with the flat, uninterested efficiency of someone who had done far larger versions of this before and found it beneath comment. Clone troopers who fired at him were disarmed, thrown, or simply stepped past. Not one of them died by his hand in those first minutes, a detail that would matter enormously later, though none of the survivors understood why at the time. He was not here to kill soldiers. Soldiers were not, in his long accounting, ever really the problem. The droid legion fared little better on the opposite flank, though he engaged them with even less interest, tearing through a squad of B-1S with the bored economy of someone swatting insects that had wandered too close to something important. A super battle droid unit, more heavily armored, managed to land a sustained volley that actually staggered him. The first resistance all morning that registered as resistance at all, and Thanos turned to face it with something that might, on another face, have been the beginning of a smile. He closed on it, tore the droid's cannon arm free at the shoulder joint, and used it to collapse the ridge position it had been defending, burying 6 more droids under rockcrete rubble. By the time both commanding officers, a clone captain named Rook and a separatist tactical droid designated TX-31, managed to signal a mutual, unspoken, entirely unofficial ceasefire and withdraw their remaining forces to opposite ends of the valley, 11 minutes had passed since the sky had torn open. Thanos stood alone in the crater at the center of a battlefield that had, for the first time in 6 months, gone completely silent. He looked up at the sky where the wound had already sealed itself, leaving no scar, no proof, nothing but 2 suns he did not recognize setting over a horizon he had never seen. Then he looked down at his own hand, bare, empty, no gold-plated weights settled across the knuckles, no 6 sockets waiting to be filled. For a long moment, the mad titan simply stood there, cataloging the loss with the same cold precision he cataloged everything. The gauntlet was gone. The stones were gone, scattered somewhere he could not yet name across a galaxy he did not yet understand. His plan, the only plan that had ever mattered, the culling that would have brought balance to a trillion worlds with a single gesture, was gone with them. What remained was simpler, and in its way, more honest. A body built to end civilizations. A mind that had spent a lifetime studying the mathematics of suffering and scarcity. And a fresh war spread out beneath 2 strange suns that seemed, even from this first glimpse, to be making precisely the same mistake his own people had made before he ended them. He began walking toward the nearest settlement, unhurried, already thinking in terms of populations and resources and ratios, already beginning the calculation he had run 1,000 times on 1,000 worlds. Behind him, unnoticed in the chaos, a single fist-sized fragment of gold-violet metal, a fraction of the gauntlet's housing, torn loose in the crossing and buried 3 meters down in the crater's rubble, settled quietly into the dark, waiting. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. The settlement nearest the crater was called Halvo Reach, a cluster of prefabricated domes and tabana refineries that had existed in relative peace for 3 generations before the war found it. Its 400 residents had spent the last 6 months learning the rhythms of occupation and counter-occupation, which alarms meant shelter, which meant flee, which meant nothing at all except another patrol passing through. They had not learned, because no one could have taught them, what alarm was appropriate for a god walking up the main causeway in the wreckage of the morning's battle. Thanos did not announce himself. He did not need to. His presence announced itself. In the way the causeway's duracrete cracked faintly beneath each footstep. In the way the settlement's aging security droids, 3 of them, unarmed, meant only to log traffic, simply stopped functioning as he passed, their processors unable to reconcile his mass with anything in their threat assessment libraries. He walked through the market square, past stalls of dried tuberroot and black market power cells. And the settlement's inhabitants did what frightened populations have always done in the presence of something they cannot understand. They went very still, and they watched, and they waited to learn whether stillness would be enough to survive. It was Captain Rook who reached him first, against every instinct of self-preservation and every regulation in the Republic's field manual. Rook was CT-4409 by designation. Rook by the nickname his squad had given him after a training exercise involving a chess analog game none of them fully understood, and he had survived 4 campaigns by being the kind of officer who assessed situations rather than reacted to them. He approached with his hands visibly empty, rifle slung, flanked by 2 troopers who had not been given permission to accompany him, and had come anyway. "You're not separatist," Rook said. It wasn't a question. The armor plating was wrong, the proportions were wrong, and nothing in 6 months of fighting droids had prepared him for something that bled. He'd seen the scattered blaster scoring on that chest plate, seen it simply not matter. "I am not," Thanos agreed. His voice was low, resonant, unhurried, the voice of someone entirely unconcerned with how the conversation might end. "Nor am I whatever your enemy calls itself. I have no interest in your war sides, Captain. I have interest in your war's arithmetic." Rook did not understand the word choice, and said so. Thanos studied him for a long moment, studied all of them. The trooper at his left with a fresh scar along his jaw, the trooper at his right whose hands were not quite steady on his rifle despite his training, and found himself, unexpectedly, willing to explain. "For 1,000 souls on this rock," Thanos said. "A garrison feeding itself from stores meant for civilians. Refineries running at capacity to fuel ships, fighting over a resource this world cannot replace once spent. I have seen this pattern on 1,000 worlds, Captain. It ends one of 2 ways. Someone imposes balance, or the imbalance imposes itself. Famine, collapse, a slower and uglier death than any blaster offers. I did not start your war, but I have already begun to understand its shape." "That's not," Rook started, then stopped, because he genuinely did not know how to finish the sentence. He had not expected philosophy from something that had torn a super battle droid's arm off with its bare hand an hour earlier. "That's not really something I can take back to command." "No," Thanos agreed, almost gently. "It rarely is." It was the tactical droid TX-31, watching from a concealed vantage on the ridge through a long-range optic feed, who first transmitted the encounter up the Separatist chain of command with something approaching alarm in its otherwise flat vocal processor. Asterisk, recommend immediate reclassification of unknown hostile as strategic priority target. Observed combat efficiency exceeds all logged threat parameters for organic combatants. Recommend count Duke be notified directly. Asterisk, the recommendation reached Sereno within the hour. Filed alongside grainy footage of a single figure dismantling a fortified position that had held for 6 months in under 10 minutes. Aboard a Republic cruiser in orbit above Devron's reach, Captain Rook's report reached a different audience. Not Coruscant directly, not yet, but a Jedi general named Ash Varnell, a Twi'lek consular attached loosely to the sector fleet, whose primary talents ran toward diplomacy and battlefield medicine rather than combat. She reviewed the footage twice, then a 3rd time, her leku drawing tight against her skull in the particular way that betrayed unease to anyone who knew her well enough to read it. What unsettled her was not the violence. She had seen worse on both sides in 6 months of war. What unsettled her was the restraint threaded through it. Every clone trooper in that footage had survived contact. Every droid casualty had been incidental to clearing terrain, not deliberate slaughter. A being capable of that violence had chosen, again and again, not to kill soldiers who were shooting at him. That was not the behavior of a mindless threat. That was the behavior of something operating according to a philosophy she did not yet understand. And, in her experience, philosophies were far more dangerous than mindlessness. Mindlessness could be predicted. She sent the footage on to Coruscant with a priority flag and a note, brief and uncharacteristically blunt for a woman known for her careful diplomatic phrasing. Asterisk, this is not a monster. This is worse. This is someone with a plan. Asterisk. By the time the transmission reached the Jedi Temple, it had already been intercepted, copied, and quietly forwarded through 3 additional channels. One of them Confederate, one of them criminal, and one of them belonging to a network so deeply buried within the Republic's own intelligence apparatus that even the Jedi Council did not know of its existence. Palpatine, in his Chancellor's office high above Coruscant's endless traffic, watched the same 11 minutes of footage that had reached Dooku and the Jedi Council within the hour, his expression, as always, giving away precisely nothing. He watched Thanos walk through the trench line a second time, slower, studying not the violence, but the restraint around its edges. The troopers spared here, the droid disarmed rather than destroyed there, and something in his ancient, patient calculation shifted very slightly, the way a predator's ears shift toward a sound too distant yet to name as prey or rival. Interesting, he said quietly, to no one, and set the footage aside for later, more careful study. Back on Devron's Reach, Thanos had continued through Halvo Reach without incident, the settlement's population parting before him in silence, broken only by the low murmur of children being pulled indoors, and the click of shutters closing over viewports that offered no real protection, and everyone knew it. He stopped at the settlement's central well, an old, functional piece of infrastructure, the kind of unglamorous machinery that kept 4,000 people alive regardless of which flag flew over the ridge, and studied it for a long moment with an expression that, on a smaller and less monstrous face, might have been read as something close to nostalgia. An old woman, one of the settlement's Tabana refinery supervisors, had not fled indoors with the others. She stood at her stall, arms crossed, watching him with the particular fearlessness of someone who had already survived worse and had decided, on some private calculation of her own, that flight would gain her nothing. "You going to kill us then?" she asked. Her voice did not shake. Thanos turned to regard her fully for the first time, and something in the directness of the question seemed to earn a fraction more of his attention than anything the soldiers had offered. "Not today," he said. "Not you, specifically. You have not yet cost this world more than it can bear to lose." "That's not an answer." "It is the only honest one I have," Thanos said. "I do not know this galaxy yet. I do not know its numbers, its balance, what it can sustain and what it cannot. I intend to learn. When I have learned, I will act accordingly, as I have always acted, on every world I have known. Whether that includes you or this settlement or this war at all is a question I cannot yet answer, because I do not yet have enough information to answer it honestly. I find dishonest comfort worse than uncomfortable truth. I suspect, from the look of you, that you agree." The old woman held his gaze a moment longer. Then, to the visible astonishment of everyone still watching from behind shuttered windows, gave a single short nod, as though some grim internal ledger had been updated and found, for now, acceptable. "Then I suppose we'll be watching you," she said. "Same as everyone else." "That," Thanos said, turning to continue past the well and out toward the settlement's edge, where the rust-colored hills rolled toward a horizon he still did not recognize, "seems entirely fair." He walked until Halvo Reach was a distant cluster of light behind him, until the sounds of the war, distant artillery from some other contested ridge, the whine of a fighter patrol crossing overhead, faded into the general silence of an alien wilderness. He did not know yet where the gauntlet's fragments had scattered, did not know what forces in this galaxy might already be moving to claim him as an asset or eliminate him as a threat, did not know the names Dooku or Sidious or the Jedi Order that even now argued fiercely about what he represented. What he knew, standing alone on a ridge beneath two unfamiliar suns, was simpler and in its way more dangerous. He had arrived in a galaxy already committing, in slow and grinding increments, the very sin his own people had committed before their extinction taught him the cost of vanity. A civilization spending itself past sustainability, dressed in the noble language of a cause. He had seen this before. He had ended it before. The only question that remained, the only one that mattered, standing here with empty hands and a mind already running the numbers, was whether this galaxy would offer him a reason to believe its outcome might be different. He did not yet think it would. The Jedi Temple's High Council chamber had weathered 6 months of War Council sessions with the particular exhaustion of an institution stretched across too many fronts by too few hands. By the time General Ash Varnell's report reached the full council, routed through Master Winda's office with a priority flag that had not been used since the war's opening weeks, the footage had already been viewed, in fragments and rumors, by nearly every Jedi still stationed at the temple. What the council convened to discuss, in the amber evening light filtering through the chamber's high windows, was not whether the being on Deverin's reach was dangerous. That much was self-evident. What they convened to discuss was what, precisely, he was. "Not Sith," said Master Windu, seated in his customary place. The recording paused on a frame showing Thanos mid-stride through the shattered trench line. No lightsaber. No visible use of the Force in the engagement, no telekinetic displacement, no precognitive dodging, nothing that reads as Force-assisted combat in the footage. And yet, this from Master Plo Koon, his voice measured through his breath mask. The Council has felt nothing in the Force to correspond with his arrival. No disturbance, no ripple, as though he stands entirely outside it, not shielded, not hidden, simply absent from it, the way a stone is absent from a river it sits within. Master Yoda, smallest and stillest presence in the chamber, had said nothing through the initial discussion, his eyes fixed not on the frozen hollow image, but on some middle distance that suggested his attention was elsewhere entirely, turned inward toward the Force itself, listening for something the other's analysis could not reach. When he finally spoke, the chamber quieted immediately. "Felt this, I have, once before," Yoda said slowly. "Not this being, this shape. A wound in the galaxy's skin, healing itself even as it opens. Old, this feeling is. Older than the Sith. Older, perhaps, than the Jedi." He paused, ears drawing back slightly, an expression on his ancient face that few in the chamber had seen there before, not fear precisely, but its careful and considered cousin. "Warn you, I must judge him only by what he has done. We cannot. Judge him we must, also, by what he has not done. Killed no soldier who fired upon him. This being has. Spared a settlement he could have taken with ease. This is not the pattern of a beast. This is the pattern of a philosophy, and philosophies harder to defeat than armies. They are, because armies can be outmaneuvered, but a philosophy must be answered." "Then someone should go answer it," Winda said. The question of who consumed the better part of an hour's debate, a debate conducted with the particular care of an institution that had already committed the vast majority of its order to a war spread across 1,000 systems, and could not easily spare its most capable warriors for a single unknown variable on an unimportant world. Anakin Skywalker was engaged at Christophsis, his fleet action too critical to redirect. Obi-Wan Kenobi was 3 sectors distant, embedded with a garrison that could not be abandoned without risking a separatist breakthrough. Ki-Adi-Mundi, Aayla Secura, Luminara Unduli. Every senior general the Council might have sent was already committed to a front that could not be weakened without cost measured in lives. It was General Varnell herself, still in orbit above Deverin's reach, who was ultimately given the assignment, not because the Council believed her the Order's most formidable combatant, though she was a capable duelist in her own right, but because she was already present, already had eyes on the situation, and because Yoda, in a moment that surprised several masters present, specifically requested her. "A diplomat first she is," Yoda said, when Windu raised the obvious concern. "Warrior second. This, I think, is what this meeting requires. Not a duel, we send her toward a conversation." "And if conversation fails?" Windu asked. "Then failed. It will have failed regardless of who we send," Yoda said. "Better a failure that teaches us something than a victory that teaches us nothing." Aboard the cruiser above Deverin's reach, Varnell received the Council's authorization with the particular weight of an assignment she had not sought and was not certain she wanted. She had spent the war treating burns and coordinating evacuations more often than crossing blades with separatist commanders, and the footage of the trench line, the arm torn from a super battle droid shoulder, used as a bludgeon, the casual and total absence of effort in every motion, had not left her thoughts since she first watched it. She requested and was granted a support team. Captain Rook's platoon, still stationed planetside and already possessing whatever fragile rapport had been established in that first encounter, and a pair of ARC troopers assigned as additional escort. She descended to Deveron's Reach at dawn the following day, her cruiser's shuttle setting down on the same ridge where the sky had torn open 40 hours earlier. The crater was still there, scorched and raw. Rockcrete dust settled into every crevice like ash after fire. Of Thanos, there was no immediate sign. He had walked out into the rust-colored hills the previous evening and not returned to any settlement since, according to the scattered civilian reports that had trickled in through the night. It was Rook, walking the crater's rim with the careful attention of a soldier who had learned the hard way not to trust silence, who spotted the fragment. It lay half buried in the loose rubble at the crater's deepest point, roughly the size of a clenched fist. Its surface a fusion of gold and deep violet metal unlike any alloy catalogued in the Republic's material databases. It hummed faintly when Rook's boot came within a meter of it. Not an audible sound, but a pressure behind the eyes, the particular unpleasant sensation of standing too near an active power conduit. He called Varnell over before touching it. The Jedi general crouched at the crater's edge and studied the fragment for a long moment without reaching for it, her Leku drawing tight in the way that, by now, every trooper on her team had learned to read as concern. "Do not touch this," she said quietly, to Rook, to the ARC troopers, to herself. "Do not touch this at all." She extended her senses toward it instead, the way she might toward a wounded animal or an unstable ordnance charge, and found nothing. Not the comforting hum of a lightsaber crystal, not the corrupted static of a Sith artifact, not any resonance she had ever encountered in the Force at all. It was simply absent, a small perfect void sitting in the rubble, and the absence itself felt wrong in a way she lacked the vocabulary to properly describe in her report. She had it sealed in a containment case meant for unstable ordnance, marked for transport back to the Temple archives, and made a note, underlined twice in her field log, that the Council needed to see this before anyone attempted to study it further. She did not yet know what the fragment was. She did not know it was a shard of the Gauntlet's housing, torn free in the crossing between universes, or that its absence from the Force was not a flaw in the metal, but a fundamental property of what it had once helped contain, a splinter of power that did not answer to midichlorians or kyber crystals or anything the Jedi understood as the natural order of things. She knew only that it unsettled her more deeply than the footage of the trench line had, and that instinct, honed over a war's worth of hard decisions, told her the two things were connected in a way that mattered. She found Thanos 2 hours later, roughly 6 kilometers from the crater, standing at the edge of a dry riverbed and studying the erosion patterns in the rust-colored stone with an attention that seemed almost scholarly. He did not turn as she approached, flanked at a careful distance by Rook's platoon and the 2 ARC troopers, though the set of his shoulders made clear he had registered their presence long before they came within visual range. "A negotiator," Thanos said, without turning. "Not a soldier. They send their gentlest hand first. Sensible." "I'm General Ash Varnell," she said, stopping at what she judged a respectful but non-threatening distance, her hands visible and empty, lightsaber hilt clipped but unlit at her belt. "Of the Jedi Order. I'd like to talk." Now he did turn, and the full weight of his attention settled on her the way sunlight settles on a single leaf in a vast forest, not hostile, not yet, but total, absolute, the attention of something that had spent millennia learning to read the value and danger of everything it looked at. "Then talk," Thanos said. "I find I have not yet decided what I think of your order. Perhaps you can help me decide." Varnell felt, for the first time since receiving her assignment, something other than dread settle into the space where her nerves had been, a small, cautious flicker of something closer to hope, the professional instinct of a diplomat recognizing a door left, deliberately or not, slightly ajar. "I can try," she said, and stepped closer, into the shadow of a being who had already decided the fate of 1,000 worlds before this one, and had not yet decided the fate of this. They spoke for the better part of an hour beside the dry riverbed, and it was, by any measure Varnell could apply afterward, one of the strangest conversations of her life. Thanos answered her questions with a directness that unsettled her more than evasion would have. No diplomatic hedging, no political calculation in his phrasing, simply the flat and considered honesty of someone who had long ago stopped caring whether the truth made him more or less dangerous in his listener's eyes. He told her of the gauntlet, though not by that name, describing instead an instrument I built to enforce a balance my own people refused to enforce themselves. He told her of Titan, of overpopulation and collapse, of a warning he had offered his own civilization, and a culling he had ultimately performed himself after that warning went unheeded. Delivered in the same tone another being might use to describe a difficult harvest, not boastful, not remorseful, simply factual. Varnell listened with the particular stillness of a Jedi trained to receive difficult truths without flinching, though she felt more than once the Force itself seemed to recoil faintly from the weight of what he was describing. "You're talking about genocide," she said finally, when he paused. "I'm talking about arithmetic," Thanos corrected, without heat. "Genocide targets a people for what they are. I have never done that. I remove numbers indiscriminately until the remainder can sustain itself. It is not cruelty, General. It is the opposite of cruelty. Cruelty is watching a civilization starve slowly across a generation and calling it mercy because no single hand delivered the blow." "And if we told you we found another way?" Varnell asked. "That the Jedi exist, in part, to prevent exactly the kind of collapse you're describing, to help civilizations find balance without a body count." Something in Thanos' expression shifted at that. Not agreement, not quite, but a flicker of genuine interest. The look of a scholar encountering a counter-argument he had not previously considered credible. "Then show me," he said. "You have a war consuming a galaxy of trillions, General. Show me your order's balance in the middle of that." It was, Varnell would later admit in her report to the Council, the single hardest question anyone had asked her in 6 months of war, and she did not have an answer for it that survived contact with her own conscience. She told him, instead, the truth, that the war was a failure the Jedi had not chosen and had not yet found a way to end, that the Order was stretched thin trying to protect what could be protected while searching, imperfectly, for a path to peace. Thanos listened to this with the attentive patience of someone cataloging evidence, and when she finished, he nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed rather than refuted something he already suspected. "An honest answer," he said. "Rarer than I expected from your kind. I will consider it." He paused, studying her a moment longer. "You did not come to fight me, General. You did not come to recruit me either, not truly, though your council likely hoped you might. You came to understand me, so that others could decide what to do about me later. That is the most honest reason anyone has approached me in a very long time." "Is that a compliment?" "It is an observation," Thanos said. "I have not yet decided if I approve of your order, General Varnell, but I do not yet disapprove of you." He turned back toward the riverbed. The conversation, by his own unspoken judgment, apparently concluded. "Tell your council this. I am not their enemy. I am not yet anyone's enemy in this galaxy, but I will not be recruited, threatened, or dismissed as a curiosity, either. I intend to learn what this galaxy is before I decide what, if anything, I intend to do about it. Your council would be wise to grant me that time rather than force my hand prematurely." Varnell returned to her cruiser with more questions and answers, and a report that would occupy the council for the better part of a week, unaware that a second visitor had already begun making his own approach toward Deverin's reach, moving with considerably less patience than the Jedi Order had shown. Count Dooku's personal shuttle, sleek and unmarked, entered the system less than 6 hours after Varnell's departure. He had watched TX-31's footage a dozen times in the 2 days since it reached Sereno, and unlike the Jedi Council's careful institutional deliberation, his own calculation had been swift, singular, and entirely pragmatic. A being capable of dismantling a fortified position in 10 minutes, apparently immune to conventional weapons fire, was either the greatest asset the Confederacy could acquire or the greatest threat it would ever face, and Dooku had built his entire career on the principle that such uncertainties were best resolved through direct, personal negotiation rather than delegated to subordinates who might bungle the opportunity. He found Thanos exactly where TX-31 surveillance drones had tracked him, still near the dry riverbed, seated now on a flat outcropping of rust-colored stone, apparently in no hurry to go anywhere at all. Dooku's shuttle set down at a respectful distance, and the former Jedi emerged alone, cloak settling around him in the thin planetary wind, lightsaber visible at his belt but not drawn, hands clasped behind his back in the posture of a man approaching a negotiation rather than a battle. "You have already met one delegation today," Dooku said, by way of greeting, his voice carrying the cultured, unhurried cadence of a career diplomat and duelist both. "I confess I hope to make a better impression than the Jedi." Thanos regarded him with the same total, unhurried attention he had given Varnell, though something in his expression suggested he found this second visitor a different species of interesting entirely. "You are not with the army that occupied this ridge," he observed, "nor the one that defended it." "I am Count Dooku of Sereno," Dooku said. "I lead the Confederacy of Independent Systems, the army your Republic soldiers were fighting. Though I confess the war's particulars matter to me considerably less than they once did. I have watched your work, sir. It was, if I may say so, magnificent. I have not seen a demonstration of raw capability like it in decades of studying warriors across this galaxy." "Flattery," Thanos said, "rarely survives contact with me intact. Say what you came to say, Count." Dooku's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile, the expression of a man who respected directness even when it cost him a preferred approach. "Very well. I came to offer you a place, sir. Not as a soldier. I would not insult you with so pedestrian a title. As an equal partner in a project I believe you would find considerable sympathy with. The galaxy you have fallen into is drowning in a war it does not have the wisdom to end. The Republic clings to a broken democracy corrupted past any hope of reform. I offer an alternative, a galaxy remade under clearer, harder principles. I suspect, from what I have observed of your methods, that we may share more philosophy than either of us initially expects." "You want a weapon," Thanos said flatly. "I want an ally," Dooku corrected, though the distinction, Thanos noted silently, was thinner than the Count perhaps believed it to be. "I have resources at my disposal that even you might find useful. Access to information networks spanning 1,000 systems, technology decades ahead of Republic standard, and considerable resources that could help you locate whatever it is you lost in your crossing. TX-31 surveillance noted your search pattern along this riverbed, sir. You are looking for something. I could help you find it considerably faster than you will manage alone." It was, Thanos noted with a cold clarity that had guided every major decision of his existence, an intelligent offer. The Count had correctly identified the one lever most likely to move him, and had done so within hours of first contact, a speed of insight that spoke well of the man's capabilities even as it spoke poorly of his ultimate trustworthiness. A being that identified your deepest need this quickly and offered to fill it this readily was not offering charity. He was offering a leash disguised as a gift. "You are correct that I am searching for something," Thanos said. "You are incorrect that offering to help me find it purchases my loyalty. I have led armies before you were born, Count Dooku. I have been offered crowns by beings considerably more persuasive than you, in service of causes considerably more compelling than a rebellion against a corrupt Senate. I decline your offer." Something flickered across Dooku's composed features, not quite anger, but the particular frustration of a skilled negotiator watching a carefully constructed opening close before he had finished walking through it. "You reject an alliance before you understand its full terms." "I reject an alliance because I understand its terms perfectly," Thanos said, rising from the outcropping to his full and considerable height, and for the first time since the Count's arrival, something in his posture shifted from patient consideration toward something colder, more final. "You did not come to offer me partnership, Count. You came to determine whether I could be used. I have met 1,000 versions of you across 1,000 worlds. Clever men who mistake other people's power for a resource to be spent on their own ambitions. I find I have very little patience left for the pattern, however elegantly you dress it." Dooku's hand drifted almost imperceptibly toward his lightsaber hilt, a reflex more than a decision, the instinct of a duelist recognizing a conversation curdling toward violence, and stopped there, held by a calculation of his own. He had watched the footage. He knew, with the same cold clarity Thanos possessed, that whatever advantage his blade might offer against a Jedi or a Confederate rival, it would likely prove insufficient here. "A pity," Dooku said instead, withdrawing his hand, his composure reasserting itself with practiced ease. "I had hoped we might have avoided becoming adversaries, sir. I find I respect you a great deal even now." "Respect and alliance are not the same currency, Count," Thanos said. "I suspect you understand that, as well as I do. Return to your confederacy. Tell your master, for I do not believe for a moment that you serve no one, that I have declined his offer before it was even made directly. Tell him also that I am not yet his enemy, but I have made an enemy today, Count Dooku, and I suspect I have made him carelessly, in refusing you as plainly as I have." Dooku studied him a long moment, weighing no doubt a dozen possible responses before settling. Wisely, Thanos judged on the one that cost him the least. "Then I will simply say this, sir, and take my leave. The offer remains open, should your circumstances change. The galaxy has a way of humbling even the mightiest visitors in time. I suspect you will find that particular lesson familiar." He turned and walked back toward his shuttle without waiting for a reply, cloak trailing behind him in the thin wind. And Thanos watched him go with the flat, considering attention of a being who had just made, deliberately and with full understanding of the cost, his first true enemy in this galaxy, and who found, turning the decision over once more in his mind, that he did not regret it in the slightest. Somewhere above Coruscant, in a chamber that admitted no natural light and answered to no title the Senate would have recognized, Darth Sidious received Dooku's report of the encounter within the hour, and listened to his apprentice's account of the Titan's refusal with an attention considerably sharper than the frustration Dooku expected. "He refused you," Sidious said when the report concluded, "because you offered him a crown, my friend. Kings are for lesser men. I suspect our visitor requires a rather different conversation entirely, and I find myself increasingly curious to have it myself." News of Dooku's rejection spread through the Confederacy's upper command with a particular speed reserved for humiliations rather than victories, and reached the Republic's own intelligence networks not long after. Varnell's report of the riverbed conversation crossing paths within Coruscant's sprawling bureaucracy, with a second and considerably more alarming dispatch describing a separatist shuttle's brief and unproductive visit to the same coordinates. The council convened again, this time with a new and uncomfortable question at its center. If Thanos would not be recruited by the Confederacy, would he be recruited by the Republic instead? And did the Order actually want him if he could? Thanos, for his part, remained entirely unaware of and entirely indifferent to the debate his existence had provoked in two separate seats of galactic power. He spent the following 3 days in a manner that would have surprised anyone expecting a being of his reputation to seek out conflict, walking the rust-colored hills of Devron's Reach in a widening spiral from the crash crater, studying the land, the settlements, the scattered refugee camps that had grown up around the Tabana refineries as displaced families from harder-hit sectors of the war drifted toward whatever safety Halvo Reach's relative stability could offer. What he found, moving through those camps with the quiet, unhurried attention of a scholar conducting a census, only confirmed the calculation he had already begun on his first walk through Halvo Reach's market square. The numbers did not work, for settlements sharing resources meant for two. Refineries running past sustainable capacity to fuel a war effort that consumed more than either army's presence contributed back to the local economy. Children, and this detail, more than any other, seemed to settle into his calculation with particular weight, going without adequate rations not because the galaxy lacked resources, but because two armies had decided this world's resources belonged to their war rather than its people. He did not intervene, not yet. He watched and catalogued, and let the shape of his eventual conclusion assemble itself with the patience of someone who had learned, across a very long existence, that conclusions reached too quickly were rarely conclusions that survived scrutiny. It was on the 4th day that the criminal underworld made its first approach, not through any grand gesture, but through the considerably more practical medium of a Twi'lek information broker named Selav Ashton, who operated a modest, but well-connected smuggling network out of Halvo Reach's refinery district and had, over 6 months of war, become extremely good at recognizing profitable opportunity before her competitors did. She found Thanos at the edge of the largest refugee camp, watching a Republic supply drop distribute ration packs to a line of waiting civilians with the kind of critical attention a quartermaster might bring to an inventory audit. She approached without the fear that had characterized nearly everyone else's interactions with him, not because she was braver than the soldiers or the Jedi general who had come before her, but because fear, in Selavashton's professional experience, was rarely a useful instrument in negotiation, and she had built her entire career on being useful rather than afraid. "You've been walking my territory for 4 days without spending a single credit," she said, falling into step beside him with the easy confidence of someone entirely used to talking to dangerous men. "That's either very poor manners, or you don't know yet that you need what I sell." Thanos glanced down at her with an expression that, on another face, might have suggested faint amusement. "And what is it you sell?" "Information mostly," Sela said. "Resources when information isn't enough. Connections when resources aren't enough. I run a network across 6 systems in this sector. Not big enough to interest the Hutts, not so small the Confederacy or the Republic bothers shutting me down. I keep this settlement fed when the war forgets to. I keep families together when troop movements try to split them apart. And I've been watching you walk through my camps for 4 days doing the same kind of math I do every single morning, big man. So I figure either you're about to become a very serious problem for my business, or you're about to become the most useful partner I've ever had." It was, Thanos noted with genuine interest, an approach entirely unlike either Varnell's careful diplomacy or Dooku's transactional flattery. No attempt to recruit him into an army. No philosophical framing of causes greater than himself. Simply a direct and honest accounting of mutual usefulness between 2 parties who had both independently arrived at the same understanding of this world's broken arithmetic. "You keep this settlement fed," Thanos said. "How?" "Badly some months," Sela admitted, with the particular candor of someone who had learned that honesty, deployed selectively, built more durable trust than any polished lie. "I smuggle rations past checkpoints both armies would rather starve civilians than let slip through. I trade information to whichever side will pay for it, and use the credits to buy medicine the Republic's supply chain forgets exists out here. I'm not a good person, if that's what you're measuring. I'm a useful one. There's a difference, and in 6 months of war, I found the useful ones outlast the good ones roughly every single time." Thanos found himself, for the first time since his arrival, genuinely engaged rather than merely observant. "You have built a small balance of your own out here," he said slowly, "against the imbalance of a war neither side controls." "I mean, sure, if you want to put a fancy word on it," Sela said. "I call it staying alive and keeping my people alive with me. But yeah, balance. I like that better than most of the words the War Council types use." She studied him a moment, weighing something, then continued, her tone shifting slightly toward the pragmatic. "Look, I don't know what you are. I don't particularly care what you are. What I care about is that you clearly have resources I don't, strength obviously, but also, if the rumors from that riverbed meeting are true, patience and standards most warlords in this sector don't bother with. I've got a network. You've got capability. I think we could be very good for each other's arithmetic." It was, Thanos reflected, turning the offer over with the same careful consideration he had given Dooku's crown and found wanting. An entirely different proposition. Dooku had offered him command of armies in service of a cause Thanos found no deeper wisdom in than the war it claimed to end. Selavashton was offering him something smaller, more honest, and, he found himself surprised to note, considerably more aligned with the actual problem he had spent 4 days cataloging on the ground rather than in the abstract language of galactic politics. "What would you ask of me?" Thanos said, "in exchange for this partnership?" "Protection mostly for my routes and my people," Sela said. "Muscle when the Hutts or the Black Sun try to push into territory I've already claimed. And they will. The second word spreads that something like you is operating in this sector. And information flows both ways. You help me move resources where this world actually needs them, and I help you learn this galaxy faster than either the Republic or the Confederacy would ever bother teaching you. Because frankly, neither of them actually wants you to understand it. They both just want you to fight for it. The observation landed with more weight than Sela likely intended, and Thanos found himself considering it for a long moment in silence. She was, he recognized, entirely correct. Both Varnell's Jedi Council and Dooku's Confederacy had approached him already committed to their own conclusions about what he should become, each hoping to fold his capability into a cause already decided before he arrived. Sela Vashton, whatever her flaws, whatever compromises her survival had required across 6 months of grinding war, was offering him something neither had: the chance to actually understand this galaxy on terms that served its people rather than its factions, before deciding what role, if any, he intended to play in its future. "I will consider your offer," Thanos said finally, "on one condition. I do not answer to you, Sela Vashton. I do not answer to your network, your interests, or your enemies. I will help where I judge the arithmetic warrants it, and I will withdraw wherever I judge it does not. If that arrangement suits your ambitions, I will walk your territory a while longer and see what balance we might build together. If it does not, I will continue walking it regardless, and you may decide for yourself whether that makes me a partner or merely a very large complication." Sela studied him for a long moment, and something that might have been respect, the particular, hard-won respect of one pragmatist recognizing another, crossed her sharp features. "Big man," she said finally, extending a hand that looked absurdly small against the scale of him, "I think that's the most honest partnership offer I've had in 6 years of running this network. I'll take it." He did not shake her hand in any conventional sense. His fingers alone were larger than her entire forearm, but he inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement that would, in the weeks to come, prove to be the first genuine alliance Thanos formed in this galaxy, not with an army, not with a cause, but with a smuggler who understood, in her own small and stubborn way, exactly the kind of arithmetic he had spent 40,000 years learning to solve. Neither of them yet knew that this small, pragmatic alliance, built on shared understanding rather than shared ideology, would within the month draw the attention of forces considerably larger than either the Hutts or the Black Sun, forces that would force Thanos to reckon, for the first time since his arrival, with exactly how far he was willing to let his new philosophy of balance carry him. The alliance with Sela Vashton's network grew faster than either of them had initially anticipated. Though grew, understated the actual mechanics of what occurred over the following 2 weeks. Thanos did not build an organization in the conventional sense. He had no interest in titles, no patience for the layered hierarchies that criminal syndicates typically constructed to insulate their leadership from consequence. What he built instead was closer to a gravitational field, a presence so overwhelming that smaller operators, warlords, and rival smuggling outfits across the sector began reorganizing their own ambitions around the simple fact of his existence, without his ever issuing a direct order to any of them. Sela's routes, previously harassed by Black Sun enforcers demanding tribute and Hutt-affiliated pirates skimming cargo at 3 separate checkpoints, ran unmolested within the first week. Not because Thanos had personally destroyed every threat, though he had, methodically and without particular ceremony, dismantled 2 ambushes in the network's first several days, but because word of those dismantlings had traveled through the sector's underworld with a particular speed reserved for cautionary tales. Ration shipments that had previously taken 4 days to reach outlying settlements, evading checkpoints and bribing patrol officers along circuitous routes, now moved in under a day and a half along paths no one dared interdict. It was, by any measure Thanos privately applied to it, a small and unglamorous success, a few thousand civilians better fed, a modest criminal network stabilized against its rivals, nothing approaching the scale of intervention he had once considered his singular purpose. And yet he found himself walking Halvo Reach's Market Square on the 14th day since his arrival, and observing stalls better stocked than they had been on his first, oddly satisfied by the smallness of it. It was proof, if nothing else, that balance could be built incrementally, without requiring the singular, catastrophic gesture the gauntlet had once made possible. Whether that proof would survive contact with a problem too large for incremental solutions remained, he understood, an open question. The Jedi Order, Watching this development unfold through Varnell's increasingly detailed field reports and the sector's own intelligence networks, found itself divided on how to interpret it. Some among the council, Master Winda chief among them, argued that a being of Thanos' capability building influence within the criminal underworld represented an escalating threat regardless of the apparent benefit to local civilians, a warlord's foundation being laid one favor at a time. Others, Yoda foremost, urged patience, arguing that a being capable of feeding refugees and dismantling exploitative networks was, whatever his ultimate philosophy, currently acting in closer alignment with the Order's own values than half the Republic's own Quartermaster Corps managed on any given week. It was General Varnell who was dispatched, for the second time, to make direct contact, not to negotiate an alliance, the Council had made clear, but to understand, with as much clarity as could be gathered, exactly what Thanos believed he was building, and toward what eventual end. She found him this time not alone, but in conversation with Sela Vashton at the edge of a refinery loading dock, reviewing a data slate of shipping manifests with the incongruous domesticity of two business partners handling routine logistics. He acknowledged Varnell's approach with a brief glance before returning his attention to the manifest, an unhurried dismissal that told her, more clearly than any words could have, exactly how little threat he currently judged her to represent. General, he said, when the manifest review concluded and Sela had withdrawn to oversee a shipment. I find myself curious what conclusion your council has reached in the weeks since our last conversation. Honestly, they haven't reached one, Varnell admitted, deciding, as she had in their first conversation, that directness served her better with this being than diplomatic evasion. Some of them think you're building a criminal empire under the cover of humanitarian aid. Some think you're the first honest thing that's happened in this sector in 6 months. I've been sent to figure out which one is closer to true. Both, Thanos said simply. I am building influence, General. I will not insult either of us by pretending otherwise. But influence, in my long experience, is simply the capacity to enforce balance where it does not currently exist. Your Republic's supply chains ignore this sector. Your Senate's attention is consumed by systems with better lobbyists and larger populations. I have spent 2 weeks correcting a small fraction of that neglect using resources your council would never have authorized me to touch. Tell me honestly, General, does that trouble you more or less than the 6 months of neglect that preceded it? Varnell did not have a comfortable answer to that question, and did not pretend otherwise. It troubles me because I don't know what you want in the end, she said instead. Feeding refugees is good, whatever means you use to do it. But you didn't cross into this galaxy to feed refugees, did you? You told me yourself, on Titan. You didn't just help your people find balance. You imposed it. Violently, unilaterally. What happens here when incremental solutions stop being enough for you? It was, Thanos acknowledged silently, the correct question, sharper and more precisely aimed than anything Dooku's transactional flattery had managed, precisely because it did not attempt to recruit or dismiss him, but simply asked him to account, honestly, for the trajectory of his own philosophy. He considered his answer with genuine care before offering it. I do not yet know, he said finally. I have spent 40,000 years believing that gradual solutions fail civilizations too slowly to matter, that mercy delayed becomes cruelty compounded, and that the only honest answer to catastrophic imbalance is catastrophic correction. I still believe that, General, in the abstract. But I have watched these 2 weeks a smaller kind of correction take root in this sector, built one shipment and one dismantled ambush at a time. And I confess it has complicated a certainty I have held since before your species existed to hold certainties of its own. That sounds like doubt, Varnell said carefully. It sounds like data, Thanos corrected, though something in his tone suggested he did not entirely disagree with her characterization. I am not a being who abandons a conclusion lightly, General. I have seen too many civilizations pay the price for leaders who mistook doubt for wisdom and delayed necessary corrections until delay itself became the greater cruelty. But I am also not a being who ignores evidence that contradicts his priors, and this sector, small, unimportant, forgotten by both the Republic and the Confederacy that claim to fight over it, has offered me more contradicting evidence in 2 weeks than the entirety of my journey here. Varnell studied him for a long moment, searching his broad, scarred features for some tell she could report back to the council with confidence, and found instead only the same patient, considering honesty that had characterized every conversation she'd had with him since the riverbed. "So what happens," she asked finally, "if the evidence stops being enough? If this sector's small correction doesn't scale to the rest of the galaxy's problems, and you decide gradual solutions have failed the test?" Thanos did not answer immediately. He turned instead to look out across the refinery loading dock, where Sella's workers move crates of medical supplies bound for a settlement 3 systems distant. Workers who 2 weeks earlier had operated in the shadow of extortion and threat and now moved with the unremarkable efficiency of people simply doing their jobs. "Then I will do what I have always done, General," he said finally. And something in his voice, for the first time since their acquaintance began, carried a weight that sounded almost like warning directed at himself as much as at her. "I will make the hard choice, and I will not apologize for it afterward. I would prefer this galaxy give me no reason to reach that conclusion. But I would be lying to you, and worse, lying to myself, if I claimed the possibility had left my calculation entirely. Tell your council that, General. Tell them the honest answer is that I do not yet know what I will become here, and that the answer depends in no small part on what this galaxy chooses to show me next." Varnell returned to her cruiser with a report considerably more complicated than her first and a private, unshakable conviction, one she did not commit to any official record, that the fate of this entire sector, and possibly a great deal more than that, had come to depend on a smuggler's supply routes running smoothly enough for long enough to keep proving a 40,000-year-old certainty wrong one shipment at a time. She did not know, as her shuttle lifted off from Devron's reach, that events already moving in 3 separate directions, a Sith Lord's patient calculation, a starving world 3 sectors distant reaching the end of its own arithmetic, and a fragment of gold-violet metal now sealed in the Jedi Temple's deepest archive vault, would together ensure that the test Thanos feared would arrive far sooner than either of them expected. The world was called Cassandra, a mid-rim agricultural system that had, in the ordinary course of galactic events, never once appeared in a Republic Senate briefing or a Confederacy strategic assessment. It had no Tabanagas, no strategic hyperspace lane, no resource that either side of the war considered worth the cost of contesting it directly. What it had, instead, was the particular misfortune of sitting adjacent to 3 separate contested systems, each of which had spent the war's first 6 months routing refugees, displaced populations, and increasingly, as both armies requisitioned local agriculture to feed their own supply lines, desperate migrants toward the one nearby world that had not yet been directly touched by battle. Cassandra had been built to sustain perhaps 2 million people at comfortable capacity. By the time Selavashton's network first flagged it in a routine intelligence sweep, its population had swollen past 11 million, its agricultural output requisitioned at gunpoint by both Republic quartermasters and Separatist logistics officers in roughly equal, entirely uncoordinated measure, its water reclamation systems failing under a burden they had never been engineered to carry. Sella brought the report to Thanos on the 16th day of their partnership, her usual pragmatic composure noticeably strained. "It's bad," she said, laying the data slate before him without preamble. "Worse than bad. My contacts on the ground say the local governments already lost control of food distribution, black markets running the actual rationing now, and not the honest kind I run. Extortion, hoarding, families selling children into indenture for ration cards. Both armies keep pulling grain shipments for their own war effort like the planet's just another supply depot instead of 11 million actual people trying to survive on infrastructure built for 2. Thanos studied the report with a particular stillness that had, over 2 weeks, become recognizable to Sella as his most dangerous quality. Not anger, not urgency, but a settling calm that preceded conclusions he did not reach lightly or reverse easily. "How long," he asked, "before collapse becomes irreversible?" "My analysts say weeks. Maybe less, if either army pulls another grain requisition before the next harvest cycle." Sella hesitated, then added, with the directness that had first earned his respect, "I know that look, big man." I've watched you build something patient and careful for 2 weeks. This isn't a problem patience solves. There's no smuggling route that fixes a 9 million person overcapacity crisis. There's no ambush I can send you to dismantle that puts food back in 11 million mouths. This is bigger than what we've been doing. I am aware, Thanos said quietly. He left Devron's reach within the hour, traveling aboard one of Sela's fastest smuggling vessels with a small escort of her most trusted operators, and arrived above Cassandra 2 days later to find the report had, if anything, understated the crisis. Orbital scans showed refugee encampments sprawling far beyond the planet's original settlement boundaries, agricultural fields stripped bare weeks before harvest by requisition convoys that had not bothered to leave enough seed stock for the following season. On the ground, in the planet's largest city, Thanos walked through streets where the black market Sela had described operated with open, desperate brutality, armed enforcers controlling ration distribution at gunpoint, families bartering away possessions, labor, and worse, for enough food to survive another week. He spent 2 days simply observing, the same patient census-taking that had characterized his first days on Devron's reach, and reached, by the end of the second day, a conclusion that felt, for the first time since his arrival in this galaxy, entirely familiar, the cold, clear mathematics he had spent 40,000 years learning to trust above every other instinct. 11 million people. Sustainable capacity for perhaps 4 million, even under optimal resource management, given the damage already done to the agricultural cycle and the water systems. No incremental correction, no dismantled ambush, no rerouted supply chain, no diplomatic pressure on either army's quartermaster corps could close a gap that large before the collapse Sela's analysts had warned of arrived on its own terms, uglier and less controlled than any deliberate intervention could ever be. He did not act immediately. He returned first to the smuggling vessel and contacted Sela directly, and the conversation that followed was, by her own later account, the first time she had heard something in his voice that sounded less like certainty and more like a man arguing with himself. I have seen this arithmetic before, Thanos told her. I know its resolution. I have performed that resolution on worlds far more populous than this one, and watched the survivors rebuild and balance within a generation. You're talking about killing people, Sela said flatly. Please don't dress it up as arithmetic when you're talking to me, big man. Say what you mean. I am talking about a culling, Thanos said, and something in the plainness of the admission seemed even to him to carry more weight spoken aloud in this context than it ever had in the abstract certainty of his old philosophy. A precise, indiscriminate reduction, not targeting the guilty or the innocent, not sparing the strong or weak, simply removing enough of the population that the remainder can survive on what this world can actually sustain. It is not cruelty, Sela. It is the only mercy this world's arithmetic currently permits. Sela was silent for a long moment on the comm channel, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost the easy pragmatism that had characterized every previous conversation between them. You asked me, 2 weeks ago, why I keep this network running instead of just taking what I need and letting the weak sort themselves out. You remember what I told you. You told me the useful ones outlast the good ones. I told you that, Sela agreed, but I also told you I care about keeping my people alive with me. Not instead of them. Not at their expense. There's a difference between hard choices and easy ones dressed up as hard, big man. And I think you're about to make the second kind and call it the first because it's the only math you've ever trusted. It was not. Thanos reflected afterward. An argument constructed with anything approaching the philosophical sophistication of Dooku's political theory or Varnell's Jedi doctrine. It was the blunt, practical objection of a smuggler who had spent 6 years building something small and careful out of a galaxy determined to grind it down, and it lodged itself in his calculation with considerably more force than either of the more polished arguments had managed. He did not abandon his conclusion, but he did, for the first time since arriving in this galaxy, delay its execution, not out of doubt in the underlying mathematics, which he still believed sound, but out of something closer to curiosity about whether Sela's objection pointed toward an alternative he had not yet fully considered. Give me 3 days, he told her. Before I act, I will attempt what you are suggesting. a correction built from resource redistribution rather than population reduction. If it succeeds, I will have learned something. If it fails, I will have lost nothing but time this world's arithmetic can barely still afford to spend. What followed over the next 3 days was, by any measure, the largest single logistical intervention Thanos had yet attempted in this galaxy, and one that drew on every resource his young alliance with Sela's network could muster, alongside a considerably more surprising second contributor. Sela's contacts reached out, on Thanos' explicit and uncharacteristic instruction, not only to sympathetic smugglers and independent operators across the sector, but directly to General Varnell, whose small Jedi Republic humanitarian relief detachment had, over 6 months of war, quietly become the sector's most experienced coordinator of exactly this kind of emergency resource triage. Varnell's response, when Sela's message reached her, was immediate and entirely without the institutional hesitation Thanos had half expected. "Tell him I'll bring every relief asset the Council will authorize," she said. "And several they won't ask too many questions about. If it means we don't have to write the report I think he's about to make necessary otherwise." Over the following 3 days, an improbable coalition assembled above Cassandra, Sela's smuggling fleet running emergency grain shipments requisitioned, through means Thanos did not inquire too closely into, from stockpiles both Republic and Separatist quartermasters had been hoarding against future campaigns. Varnell's relief detachment coordinating triage and distribution with practiced efficiency, and Thanos himself, moving through the crisis with an intensity that surprised even Sela, personally overseeing the redistribution of resources with the same cold, exacting precision he had once reserved for calculating populations that needed to be removed rather than fed. It was not, in the end, a complete solution. Cassandra's population still exceeded its sustainable capacity by a significant margin, and the emergency relief effort bought the world time rather than a permanent correction. Weeks, perhaps a few months, before the underlying imbalance reasserted itself unless something more permanent changed. But it was, Thanos acknowledged to Sela on the third night, standing together on a hastily constructed distribution platform watching grain convoys move toward encampments that had, for the first time in weeks, received a full ration allotment, something he had not expected to still be capable of feeling this deep into his own certainty. "This is not a solution," he said. "It is a delay." "Everything's a delay, big man," Sela said, watching the convoys with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. "That's what living looks like if you zoom out far enough. You delay the bad thing as long as you possibly can, and you build something worth delaying it for. That's not weakness. That's the whole job." Thanos did not answer immediately. Turning the observation over with the same careful attention, he gave every piece of evidence that complicated his 40,000-year certainty, and found, for the first time since the gauntlet had been torn from his hand, that he was no longer entirely certain which conclusion the complete arithmetic actually favored. The reprieve on Cassandra lasted 11 days. Thanos had known, even as he stood on the distribution platform watching grain convoys move toward encampments now receiving full rations, that Sela's phrase, "everything's a delay, if you zoom out far enough," was a comfort built for creatures with shorter memories than his own. He had seen 1,000 worlds by themselves exactly this kind of reprieve before, had watched the underlying imbalance reassert itself with a patient inevitability of water finding its level, and some part of him, even in that moment of uncharacteristic hope, had understood that Cassandra's arithmetic had not actually changed. It had only been postponed at considerable cost by resources that could not be replenished indefinitely. On the 12th day, a separatist requisition convoy, acting on orders from a sector command that had no knowledge of, and would not have cared about, the fragile relief effort holding Cassandra's population together, seized 4 of the largest grain shipments still in transit, redirecting them toward a Confederacy fleet staging 15 parsecs distant for an offensive that would, in the end, accomplish nothing more significant than shifting a contested supply line 40 kilometers in a direction it would shift back within the month. Thanos received the report from Sela aboard the smuggling vessel that had become, in all but name, his mobile headquarters, and read it twice before setting the data slate down with a stillness that Sela, by now fluent in the language of his silences, recognized immediately as the most dangerous kind. I can try to reroute alternate shipments, she said, already reaching for a second data slate. Already running the calculations before he'd asked her to. It'll take 4 days minimum, and even then we're looking at partial rations, not 4 days, Thanos said quietly. Is 4 days this world's arithmetic no longer has to spend? He left for Cassandra within the hour, alone this time, without waiting for Sella's fleet or Varnell's relief detachment, and something in the manner of his departure, the absence of the careful, collaborative planning that had characterized the first crisis, told Sella, watching him go, that whatever conclusion he had reached in the silence after reading her report, it was not one built for delay. What happened on Cassandra over the following 6 hours would be described, in the aftermath, through radically different accounts, depending entirely on who was doing the describing. The Republic's official report, filed weeks later once investigators finally pieced together fragmentary sensor data and traumatized eyewitness testimony, would call it a massacre. The Confederacy's intelligence assessment, considerably more clinical, would call it a demonstration of capability that necessitated immediate strategic reassessment. Sella Vashton, arriving 4 hours too late with her rerouted shipments, and finding the crisis already resolved by means she had specifically argued against, would call it, in the one conversation she and Thanos ever had about it afterward, the worst thing she had ever seen a person she respected choose to do. Thanos did not target soldiers. He did not target the black market enforcers whose brutality had characterized the ration crisis, nor the corrupt local officials who had profited from 11 million people's desperation. He moved instead through the encampments themselves, the sprawling, overflow settlements that had grown up around Cassandra's original city limits, home to the refugees and displaced whose sheer numbers had broken the world's sustaining capacity in the first place. And he performed, with the same cold, exacting precision he had once applied to half of all life across the universe he'd left behind, a culling calculated to the individual soul. Not half, this time, for he had learned enough of arithmetic's cruelty across a lifetime to know that a blunt fraction served worse than a considered number, but a precise and specific reduction, calculated down to the person, sufficient to bring Cassandra's population back within the bounds its infrastructure and remaining resources could actually sustain. It took him considerably less time than the relief effort had. That more than anything else would haunt General Varnell when she arrived on planet the following morning, summoned by a distress signal so garbled with panic that her comm officer had needed 3 attempts to parse its actual coordinates. 11 days of careful collaborative logistics, grain convoys, triage coordination, relief detachments working past exhaustion, undone and replaced in the space of a single night, by 6 hours of a single being's unilateral judgment. She found Thanos standing at the edge of the largest encampment when her shuttle set down, unmoved from where he had apparently stood since the culling's completion, and the scene around him, the particular, terrible silence of a place that had held tens of thousands of frightened, hungry people the previous evening, and now held considerably fewer, told her everything the distress signal's garbled panic had not managed to convey. "You didn't wait," she said, and her voice, normally so carefully controlled, cracked audibly on the second word. Sella was 4 hours out with rerouted shipments. 4 hours, and you. 4 hours, Thanos said, in which this world's arithmetic would have remained unresolved regardless of the shipment's arrival, because rerouted grain does not address a population overshoot this severe. Sella's relief effort bought delay, General. Delay was not a permanent solution 11 days ago, and it is not one now. So you decided that on your own. Varnell's hands, Thanos noted, had begun to shake, not with fear he understood, but with a fury she was struggling, and largely failing, to keep contained within the composed discipline her order demanded of her. You decided alone, without consulting Sella, without consulting me, without consulting a single one of the 11 million people whose lives you just recalculated like an equation. I consulted no one, Thanos agreed, because no one else in this galaxy has yet demonstrated the willingness to make this choice when delay stops being sufficient. I gave your relief effort 11 days, General. I gave it every resource my new alliance could provide. It was not enough, and it was never going to be enough, because the underlying imbalance was never actually solved, only postponed, at a cost this galaxy could not sustain indefinitely. You murdered civilians. Varnell's voice had dropped to something low and dangerous. A register Thanos had not yet heard from her in their previous conversations. Not soldiers, not enemies, refugees, families, children, Thanos. You stood in the middle of a refugee camp and decided which of them got to keep living based on arithmetic. I did, Thanos said, and something in the flat, unflinching honesty of the admission seemed, even now, to be the only currency he had ever traded in with her. I will not pretend otherwise to soften what I have done, General, because I respect you too much to insult you with a comfortable lie. I made the hard choice I told you I might be forced to make. I do not enjoy having made it. I do not regret that it needed making. Varnell stared at him for a long moment, and Thanos watched something in her, the careful, cautious hope she had extended toward him across 3 previous conversations, the diplomatic patience that had argued, in council chambers he would never see, for time and understanding rather than immediate judgment. Visibly, finally, break. The council gave you time, she said quietly. Master Yoda specifically argued for patience, for understanding, because I believed, that whatever you were building here, with Sela, with the relief effort, was evidence of something better than the mathematics you crossed into this galaxy carrying. I told them you were not a monster. I told them you were something worse, someone with a plan. I did not understand, until this moment, how right I actually was. Your council's patience was never contingent on my agreeing with your order's philosophy, General, Thanos said. It was contingent on observing what I actually chose to do. I have shown you exactly that today. I would rather you judge me honestly for it than continue extending a hope I never promised to fulfill. Varnell did not answer him again. She turned instead and walked back toward her shuttle without another word. And Thanos watched her go with the particular, familiar stillness of a being who had, across 40,000 years and 1,000 worlds, grown accustomed to being understood correctly and forgiven rarely, and who found, standing now in the silence of a refugee camp he had just permanently and irreversibly altered, that the accustomed weight of that pattern had not gotten any lighter for having crossed into an entirely new galaxy to find it waiting for him again. Word of Cassandra reached Coruscant within the day, and reached Sereno not long after. And by the following evening, both the Republic Senate and the Confederacy's shadow leadership had independently reached the same uneasy conclusion. Whatever uncertain, unaligned entity had fallen into their galaxy 3 weeks earlier, it had just demonstrated, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what it was capable of choosing to do, and exactly how little either side's authority mattered to that choice. In his private chamber above Coruscant's endless traffic, Darth Sidious watched the fragmentary sensor footage of Cassandra's aftermath with an attention considerably more focused than he had given any single event since the war's opening battles, and allowed himself, for the first time in the visitor's 3 weeks in this galaxy, something that might, on his carefully composed features, have been mistaken for genuine excitement. There it is, he murmured, to the empty chamber, to the flickering footage, to the future he had already begun, with characteristic patience, to recalculate around this new and singular variable. There, at last, is the conversation worth having. The summons, if it could be called that, given that it arrived not as a formal request, but as a single encrypted transmission routed through channels so carefully obscured that even Sela's most paranoid contacts could not trace its point of origin, reached Thanos 6 days after Cassandra, aboard the smuggling vessel that had, in the aftermath of Varnell's departure, become considerably more empty than it once had been. Sela had not confronted him the way the Jedi General had. Her fury, when it came, had been quieter, more devastating in its restraint, delivered in a single conversation on the vessel's cargo deck that had ended with her walking away and not returning for 3 days. I told you the useful ones outlast the good ones, she had said, staring at him with an expression that mixed grief and something that looked uncomfortably like recognition. Asterisk, I didn't say I wanted to watch you prove it on 11 million people. Big man. I built this network so families wouldn't have to make choices like the one you just made for them. You didn't solve Cassandra's problem. You just made sure nobody who's still alive there ever trusts anyone with power again, including me, for having introduced you to it. Asterisk. She had not ended their partnership. The shipments still ran, the routes still held, and some cold, practical part of both of them understood that severing the alliance now would help no one still depending on it. But something had changed in the 3 weeks since the riverbed. Some fragile possibility that had briefly existed in the space between Thanos' old certainty and Sella's stubborn, incremental hope, and Thanos found himself reading the encrypted transmission's contents for the first time, oddly grateful for the distraction it offered from a silence that had begun to weigh on him in ways he had not expected any conversation in this galaxy to manage. The transmission contained no threat, no demand, no attempt at the transactional flattery Dooku had offered on the riverbed 3 weeks earlier. It contained, instead, a single set of coordinates, a private landing platform in Coruscant's upper atmosphere, well above the traffic lanes and Senate towers that defined the planet's public face, and 11 words, asterisk a conversation between equals, offered without agenda. Come alone, if you wish, asterisk. He went. Not because he trusted the invitation, and not because he had run out of caution in the 3 weeks since his arrival. He had not. And every instinct honed across a lifetime of navigating court politics on a dozen worlds told him this was, in all likelihood, exactly the kind of trap a sufficiently patient adversary would construct. He went because the transmission's phrasing, between equals, had struck a note he had not heard from anyone else in this galaxy. Not Varnell's careful diplomacy, not Dooku's transactional courtship, not even Sella's hard-won, pragmatic respect. Everyone else who had approached him had done so as a supplicant, a recruiter, or a judge. Whoever had sent this transmission had addressed him, for the first time since his arrival, as though his judgment and theirs might actually occupy the same tier of consideration. The figure waiting on the private landing platform, when Thanos' borrowed shuttle set down in Coruscant's thin upper air, was smaller and less imposing than he had expected given the care that had gone into arranging their meeting. An elderly human in modest dark robes, hands clasped before him, expression composed into something that might, on a lesser observer, have registered as harmless. Thanos, who had spent 40,000 years learning to read the true weight of a being beneath whatever surface it chose to present, felt something considerably colder settle behind that harmless expression the moment he stepped from the shuttle. Chancellor Palpatine, Thanos said. He had learned the name and the office in the 3 weeks since his arrival. One more fragment of this galaxy's political architecture catalogued alongside the Republic Senate, the Confederacy's Shadow Council, and the Jedi Order's careful institutional caution. An unusual venue for a head of state. An unusual visitor deserves an unusual venue, Palpatine said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a career politician, though something beneath it. Some patient, ancient current Thanos recognized instinctively, the way a predator recognizes another predator's scent on unfamiliar ground, suggested the warmth was a garment worn rather than a truth spoken. I confess, sir, that I have followed your progress through this war with rather more interest than my public office would readily admit to. Cassandra, in particular, was instructive. You did not summon me to discuss Cassandra's political consequences, Thanos said. Your Senate has already condemned it. Your Council of Jedi has already, I suspect, begun debating whether I represent a threat requiring intervention. I doubt the Chancellor of the Republic requires a private meeting to discover conclusions his own institutions have already reached. Something in Palpatine's composed expression shifted then, not toward offense, as Thanos had half expected, but toward something closer to genuine, unguarded pleasure, the expression of a man encountering, after considerable searching, an intelligence he did not need to condescend to. No, he agreed. I did not summon you to discuss Cassandra's politics, sir. I summoned you because Cassandra confirmed something I had already begun to suspect from Count Dooku's initial report, and I find myself, after 40 years navigating this galaxy's rather tiresome political theater, in the fortunate position of finally having someone worth discussing it with honestly. Then discuss it, Thanos said. Your Council of Jedi. And I do not mean the Republic's Jedi Order specifically, sir. I mean every institution in this galaxy that presumes to arbitrate morality from a position of comfortable, self-appointed authority, believes that suffering can be managed indefinitely through patience, negotiation, and the gradual accumulation of good intentions, Palpatine said beginning to walk the platform's perimeter with unhurried, contemplative steps, and Thanos, after a moment's consideration, fell into step beside him. They believed this despite 40 years of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. I have watched as galaxy's institutions fail to solve problems considerably smaller than the one you addressed on Cassandra, sir, not through lack of resources, but through a fundamental unwillingness to accept that some problems require someone with the courage to make an unpopular, permanent choice rather than an endless series of comfortable, temporary ones. You are describing my own philosophy back to me, Thanos said, with considerably more flattery attached than it deserves. I am describing a philosophy I have held in private for considerably longer than you have existed in this galaxy, Palpatine said, and when I have found precisely no one in 40 years willing to discuss with the honesty it requires. Until now. You are correct that Count Dooku's offer of a crown was clumsy, sir. Crowns are for men who require the validation of a throne to feel the weight of their own convictions. I do not offer you a crown. I offer you something considerably rarer in this galaxy, an honest acknowledgement that we have both looked at overwhelming suffering and reached the same uncomfortable, unpopular conclusion about what its resolution actually requires. Thanos considered it far more seriously, he privately acknowledged, than he had considered any single sentence Dooku had offered on the riverbed. Because unlike Dooku's transparent recruitment, there was something in Palpatine's framing that resonated with an old and genuine part of his own certainty, the part that had watched Titan collapse under the weight of comfortable delay and vowed never again to mistake patience for mercy. You have not yet told me what you actually want from this conversation, Chancellor, Thanos said. Recognition of shared philosophy is not the same as a request. No, Palpatine agreed. It is not. What I want, sir, is considerably simpler than Count Dooku's crude offer of an army. I want you to understand that this galaxy's war, the very war whose casualties drove Cassandra's population past sustainable capacity in the first place, did not begin by accident, and will not end by accident either. I want you to understand that there are those of us who have already begun the work of building something better from its wreckage, and that a being of your capability and your clarity might find in that work a purpose considerably more permanent than smuggling grain shipments through a single sector for a criminal, however well-intentioned her aims. It was, Thanos recognized immediately, the closest thing to an honest offer he had yet received in this galaxy. Not a crown, not a partnership of convenience, but an invitation to align himself with a vision that claimed, at least in its rhetoric, to share his own fundamental diagnosis of the galaxy's disease. And it was, for exactly that reason, the offer he found himself most instinctively suspicious of, because in 40,000 years of navigating court politics and philosophical courtship, he had learned that the most dangerous offers were rarely the clumsy ones. You speak of building something better from this war's wreckage, Thanos said slowly. And yet you are, by title and office, the leader charged with ending that war rather than presiding over its wreckage. That is either a remarkable coincidence, Chancellor, or it is not a coincidence at all. Palpatine's expression did not change, but something in the silence that followed, a half-second beat, no more, but present nonetheless, told Thanos that his observation had landed considerably closer to a truth the Chancellor had not intended to reveal quite so soon. You are, as I suspected, considerably more perceptive than Count Dooku gave you credit for, Palpatine said finally, his tone unchanged, though the warmth beneath it had cooled by some small and precise degree. Very well, sir. I will not insult your intelligence with further evasion. This war is not an accident I preside over. It is an instrument I have shaped patiently over many years, toward an end I believe this galaxy genuinely requires. An end to the Senate's paralysis, the Jedi's dogmatic detachment, the endless comfortable compromise that has left worlds like Cassandra to starve while committees debate procedure. I did not summon you here to recruit a soldier, Thanos. I summoned you here because I believe you may be the one being in this galaxy capable of understanding, without flinching, exactly what that end requires, and exactly what it will cost to achieve. The admission hung in the thin coruscant air between them, and Thanos found himself, for the first time since arriving in this galaxy, genuinely uncertain how to weigh what he had just heard. He had spent 40,000 years studying the architecture of power, had built and dismantled empires, had recognized the particular calculus of leaders who manufactured crises to justify their own necessary cruelty, and had, in more instances than he cared to enumerate, been precisely that leader himself. What Palpatine had just confessed, with a candor that felt calculated rather than genuine, even as its content struck uncomfortably close to Thanos' own history, was not a revelation. It was a mirror, and Thanos had learned long ago to be considerably more suspicious of mirrors than of strangers. You have engineered a war that has killed, by conservative estimate, millions across this galaxy, Thanos said slowly, in service of an end you have not yet named. You tell me this expecting recognition, Chancellor. I confess I find myself wondering what you expect me to do with it. I expect you to recognize the shape of the choice, sir, because you have made it yourself, Palpatine said, resuming his slow circuit of the platform's perimeter. You did not arrive at Cassandra's solution through cruelty. You arrived at it through arithmetic, an unflinching accounting of costs that lesser minds refuse to perform honestly. I am engaged in precisely the same accounting, sir, at a considerably larger scale and across a considerably longer timeline. This war will end. When it does, this galaxy will require someone willing to hold the authority necessary to prevent its collapse back into the very paralysis that made the war profitable to engineer in the first place. I do not ask you to fight in it, Thanos. The war is merely an instrument, nearly spent. I ask you to consider what comes after, an order built on the same honest willingness to make the hard choice that you have already demonstrated, twice now, without my prompting. And what, precisely, does that order require of me? Patience, Palpatine said. Nothing more for now. I do not ask you to serve me, sir. I would not insult you with so pedestrian request, and I suspect, given your history, that servitude is a currency you no longer trade in regardless of who offers to purchase it. I ask only that when this war reaches its conclusion, and it will, sooner than either the Senate or the Confederacy currently believes, you consider that the galaxy which emerges from its wreckage will require exactly the kind of unflinching authority you have already shown yourself capable of exercising. I ask that you not commit yourself, in the meantime, to a smaller and more sentimental philosophy that I suspect, from what I have observed of your encounter with the Jedi General, you have already begun to doubt the wisdom of. It was, Thanos recognized, a precisely aimed observation. Palpatine had clearly received a detailed accounting of the riverbed conversation, of Cassandra's aftermath, of the fracture that had opened between Thanos and Varnell in its wake, and had constructed his entire approach around exploiting exactly that fracture. The recognition of the manipulation did not, troublingly, make the manipulation less effective. Thanos found himself turning the offer over with genuine consideration precisely because it addressed a doubt he had not fully admitted, even to himself, until Palpatine named it aloud. You want me to wait, Thanos said. To commit to nothing, align with no one, and simply exist at the edge of your war until you judge the moment ripe to call upon whatever authority you intend to seize when it ends. I want you to recognize an ally when one presents himself honestly, Palpatine said, rather than continuing to squander your considerable capability on the small, unsustainable mercies of a criminal smuggler's supply routes. Cassandra will not be the last world whose arithmetic outpaces incremental correction, sir. There will be others, dozens, perhaps hundreds, before this war concludes. Each one will present you with the same choice you made 6 days ago, and each time, your Jedi General's disapproval will grow, and Selavashton's trust will erode further, and you will find yourself eventually entirely without allies in this galaxy except the one standing before you now, who has never once pretended your methods required softening to be respected. There was, Thanos acknowledged, a considerable and uncomfortable truth threaded through the manipulation. He had felt, in the 6 days since Cassandra, the particular isolation of a being whose necessary choices had cost him the fragile alliances he had begun, almost despite himself, to value. And yet something in the totality of Palpatine's offer, the patient engineering of a war for its own eventual wreckage, the casual acknowledgement of millions of deaths as mere instrument rather than tragedy, the transactional coldness beneath the philosophical flattery, sat wrong against Thanos' own certainty in a way he had not expected, and took him several long moments of silence to properly identify. "You have manufactured suffering," Thanos said finally, "to create the conditions for your own eventual authority. That is not arithmetic, Chancellor. Arithmetic responds to an imbalance that already exists. You have created the imbalance deliberately, patiently, across years, so that you might later present its resolution as necessity rather than ambition. I have made hard choices in this galaxy. I have not, in 40,000 years, manufactured the crisis that made those choices necessary in the first place. That is the line, Chancellor, and you have just placed yourself very clearly on the wrong side of it." Something in Palpatine's composed expression flickered. Not shock precisely, but the particular, recalculating stillness of a man who had misjudged, by some small but critical margin, exactly how his honesty would land. "I see," he said slowly. "You draw a distinction between correcting an imbalance and engineering one. A fair distinction, sir, in the abstract. I wonder, though, whether it survives scrutiny. Did your own people's collapse on Titan arrive entirely without your hand shaping the conditions that made your solution seem the only honest one available? Certainty, in my experience, has a way of retroactively simplifying the path that led to it." The accusation landed with more precision than Thanos found comfortable, striking at a question he had, in 40,000 years, rarely permitted himself to examine too closely: whether his own certainty about Titan's collapse had been observation, or, in some small and unacknowledged way, prophecy fulfilling itself through his own actions and warnings. He did not answer immediately, and the silence, brief as it was, told Palpatine everything his patient calculation required. "I will not serve you," Thanos said finally, when he spoke again, his voice carrying a flat and absolute finality that closed the conversation more definitively than any accusation could have. "Not as a soldier, not as an ally in waiting, not as an instrument you have patiently cultivated across a manufactured war for your own eventual convenience. You are correct that I have made choices in this galaxy I do not fully know how to defend to those who trusted me. You are wrong to believe that uncertainty makes me a willing partner to a man who has killed millions deliberately to purchase his own authority. I have been many terrible things, Chancellor. I have never been that." Palpatine studied him for a long moment, and whatever calculation moved behind his composed features settled, finally, into something considerably colder than the warmth he had offered at the conversation's opening. "A pity," he said. "I had hoped, sir, that you might prove the one being in this galaxy capable of seeing past sentiment to the honest architecture beneath it. I see now that even you are not immune to a smuggler's grief or a Jedi's disapproval clouding otherwise clear judgment." "Perhaps," Thanos said, turning back toward his waiting shuttle. "Or perhaps I have simply learned, across a considerably longer existence than yours, Chancellor, that a philosophy which requires manufacturing its own justification was never a philosophy worth trusting in the first place. Mine included, should I ever forget the difference again." He left the platform without further ceremony, and Palpatine watched him go with an expression that had, by the time the shuttle cleared the upper atmosphere, reassembled itself into the practiced, harmless warmth he wore for every other audience in this galaxy, though the calculation behind it had already begun turning toward a considerably less patient contingency than the one he had hoped this conversation might render unnecessary. "Very well," he murmured, to the empty platform, to the vast city sprawling beneath him, to the war he had spent years patiently building toward an end this singular, unexpected variable had just refused to serve. "If you will not be my instrument, sir, then you will simply have to become my proof instead, that even the mightiest visitor this galaxy has ever received can be humbled, in time, by forces considerably more patient than his own certainty." Word of Thanos' refusal reached Dooku within 2 days, relayed through channels that told the Count considerably more than Palpatine's carefully worded transmission actually stated outright. Enough, at least, for a man of Dooku's experience to recognize that his master's patience with the Titan had curdled into something considerably more dangerous than mere disappointment. What Dooku did not yet know, and would not learn for some time, was that his master had already begun quietly redirecting resources toward a contingency that had nothing to do with recruitment at all. For Thanos, the weeks following the Coruscant meeting settled into an uneasy and increasingly isolated rhythm. Sulla's network continued to function, the alliance neither fully mended nor fully broken, sustained by the same cold pragmatism that had first brought them together. She needed his capability, however much Cassandra had cost her trust in his judgment, and he found, in the absence of any better alternative, that continuing the work of small correction remained preferable to abandoning it entirely. But something essential had shifted. Where once he had walked into every conversation in this galaxy with a settled certainty of 40,000 years, he now found himself, more often than he cared to admit, turning Palpatine's final accusation over in the quiet hours between crises. Did your own people's collapse arrive entirely without your hand shaping the conditions that made your solution seem the only honest one available? It was in this uncertain state that he first encountered the Mandalorians, the clan that found him, or more precisely, the clan whose territory he wandered into, on a resource-poor world called Calrain Station, where Sulla's network maintained a modest trading post, called itself Clan Vet, a splinter group of neutral Mandalorians who had refused to commit to either the Death Watch's insurgency or the new Mandalorians' pacifism, and had instead carved out a hard, unglamorous existence as independent contractors and salvagers along the war's fringes. They numbered perhaps 40 warriors, led by a formidable woman named Yura Vet, and they had watched Thanos' reputation spread through the sector's underworld with the particular professional interest of people who made their living assessing threats and opportunities in equal measure. Yura found him at the trading post perimeter, alone, her Beskar armor scarred from a dozen campaigns, and her posture carrying the unmistakable readiness of someone who had already decided this conversation might end in violence, and had made peace with that possibility before it began. "You're the one who cleared Cassandra," she said. Not a question. Her helmet's modulated voice carried no particular judgment in the statement, only fact. "I am," Thanos said. "My clan split on what to make of that." Yura crossed her arms, studying him through her visor with an attention Thanos recognized as fundamentally different from anything the Jedi, the Sith, or the criminal underworld had offered him. Not moral evaluation, not political calculation, but the flat, professional assessment of a warrior culture, deciding whether he represented a threat, an asset, or simply another force to be measured and understood. Half of them say you're a butcher who doesn't deserve the air he's breathing. Half say you did what needed doing, and did it without pretending it was anything softer than what it was. I came to see for myself which half's got the right of it. "And what will you tell them?" Thanos asked, "when you've seen?" "Haven't decided yet," Yura said. "Mandalorians don't much care about your reasons, big man. We care about your discipline. A being with your strength who fights carelessly is a menace. A being with your strength who fights with purpose, who knows exactly what he's spending and exactly what it costs. That's something we understand. That's something we might even respect, whether or not we agree with the cost." It was, Thanos reflected, the first time since his arrival that a faction in this galaxy had approached him without attempting to either recruit his capability toward their own cause or judge it against a philosophy he had never claimed to share. The Mandalorians, whatever else defined them, operated on a code that measured worth through action and discipline rather than professed intention, a framework that felt, to Thanos, closer to something he could actually respect than the layered political calculations of Jedi Council or Sith Master alike. "Test me then," he said. "If discipline is your measure, I would rather earn your clan's assessment honestly than have it delivered secondhand through rumor and underworld gossip." Yura studied him a moment longer, then gave a short, sharp nod that Thanos was already beginning to recognize as characteristic of her people: economical, decisive, unburdened by the theatrical hesitation he had encountered elsewhere. "There's a raiding band's been harassing the trade routes your smuggler friend runs through this sector. Pirates operating out of an asteroid cluster 2 systems distant, hitting cargo that includes, more than a few times now, medical supplies bound for refugee camps not so different from the ones you fed on Devron's Reach. My clan's been contracted to clear them out. Come with us. Fight beside us, not for us. We'll see what your discipline actually looks like when it's not aimed at unarmed civilians." The engagement that followed, 3 days later, at the pirate cluster's fortified asteroid base, would become, in a retelling that spread through Mandalorian clans across the sector in the following weeks. The encounter that first earned Thanos something he had not yet possessed in this galaxy. Not fear, not recruitment offers, not philosophical courtship, but genuine, hard-won respect from a culture that gave it rarely and revoked it never once granted. He fought beside Clan Vet's 40 warriors with a discipline that surprised even Yura's most skeptical clan members, matching his strength not against the raiders' rank and file, who Mandalorian blasters and vibroblades handled with practiced efficiency, but against the base's heaviest fortified positions and its most dangerous defenders, clearing paths that let the smaller, faster Mandalorian warriors do what they did best without exposing themselves to firepower that would have cost lives. Thanos judged unnecessary to spend. He took no life that surrendered. He extended no mercy to positions still actively threatening the convoy the mission existed to protect. It was in every particular precisely the kind of measured, purposeful violence Yura had described wanting to witness, spending exactly what the situation required, and nothing more. In the engagement's aftermath, standing amid the pirate base's wreckage with Clan Vet's warriors moving methodically through the salvage, Yura removed her helmet for the first time in Thanos' presence, a gesture he understood instinctively even without her explaining it, that carried considerable weight within Mandalorian custom. "You fight like someone who's buried people," she said, studying him with dark, assessing eyes. "Not like someone who enjoys the killing. There's a difference, and most beings your size never bother learning it." "I have buried an entire people," Thanos said. "My own. By my own hand, in the end, though not by choice I would have made if a better path had existed." Yura absorbed this without visible reaction, the particular stillness of a culture that understood loss as a fundamental currency of survival rather than a wound to be flinched from. "Then maybe that's the difference between you and the stories that reached us before you did," she said finally. "A butcher doesn't carry that kind of weight afterward. He just moves on to the next kill. You're carrying something, big man. I don't know yet if that makes what you did on Cassandra right, but it makes you something other than what the rumors painted. Does that mean your clan's assessment has shifted?" "It means Clan Vet doesn't judge a being by a single choice, however large," Yura said, resettling her helmet with a decisive click. "We judge by pattern, over time, same as we judge one of our own. You've earned a beginning today. Not trust. That's a longer road than one fight, even a fight like that one. But a beginning. That's more than most outsiders manage in this galaxy. And it's considerably more than I expected to be offering you when I walked into that trading post looking for a butcher to measure." The alliance that formed between Thanos and Clan Vet in the weeks that followed remained, by design and mutual preference, considerably looser than his partnership with Sella's network. No shared resources, no coordinated logistics. Simply a standing willingness on both sides to fight alongside one another when their interests aligned, and a mutual respect that neither side felt any particular need to define more formally than that. It was, Thanos reflected, turning the relationship over during one of the quiet hours he had come to spend increasingly often in solitary consideration since the Coruscant meeting, perhaps the most honest relationship he had yet built in this galaxy. Built on demonstrated discipline rather than philosophical alignment, on earned respect rather than transactional need. It did not resolve the doubt Palpatine's parting accusation had planted, nor mend the fracture that still sat, unaddressed and unhealed, between himself and General Varnell. But it offered him something he had not expected to find anywhere in this galaxy. Proof that a warrior's code, stripped of political calculation and philosophical courtship alike, could still recognize him as something worth respecting, even when it could not yet fully forgive him for what that respect had cost to earn. The Republic and the Confederacy had spent 6 months treating one another as the only variable in this war's equation, and it was, therefore, a considerable and uncomfortable novelty for both sides when their respective intelligence networks arrived, within days of one another and entirely without coordination, at the same unsettling conclusion. Thanos had become a third force in the sector, one whose growing web of alliances, a criminal network stabilizing supply lines across a dozen systems, a Mandalorian clan's grudging respect, a demonstrated willingness to reshape a world's population by unilateral decree, no longer fit comfortably into either side's strategic calculus. The realization reached its formal expression in a manner neither institution would have predicted 6 months earlier. A secured back-channel communication, initiated by a Republic admiral named Terz Dahlan and answered cautiously by a separatist fleet commander named Var Scala, each acting well outside the boundaries of their official authority, each gambling considerable personal risk on the judgment that this particular problem required a solution their respective governments were too slow and too compromised to authorize through normal channels. "We are not proposing an alliance," Dahlan said, in the first and only direct conversation between the two commanders, conducted over an encrypted line neither the Republic Senate nor the Confederacy's Shadow Council would ever officially sanction. "We are proposing a mutual understanding. Your separatist fleets have lost 3 convoys to raids this being's Mandalorian allies conducted against neutral shipping lanes we both depend on. My own supply chains have been quietly bypassed by a smuggling network he's turned into the sector's most efficient logistics operation, more efficient, frankly, than my own quartermaster corps, which is its own kind of humiliation I'd rather not dwell on. Cassandra proved what he's willing to do when he judges the arithmetic requires it. Neither of our governments can move fast enough through official channels to prevent the next Cassandra before it happens." "You're proposing we hunt him," Scala said, his voice modulated through a security droid's vocabulator in accordance with Confederacy communication protocol for officers wary of Republic intelligence tracing organic voice prints, carried nonetheless an unmistakable weariness. "A being who dismantled a fortified ridge position in 10 minutes and cleared 11 million people's overcapacity crisis in 6 hours. I'm proposing we contain him," Dahlan corrected, "before either the Jedi Council or Count Dooku decides unilaterally what containment looks like and drags the rest of us into whatever mess that decision creates. You've read the same reports I have. Something happened between him and the Chancellor's office 3 weeks ago. I don't know what, my intelligence can't reach that high, but whatever it was, it's changed something. He's operating without any factions oversight now, Commander, and that should frighten your government exactly as much as it frightens mine." The plan that emerged from 3 subsequent conversations was, by the admission of both commanders, an imperfect and uneasy compromise, a joint task force, deniable by both governments, drawing modest forces from each side's regional command and coordinated through a chain of custody thin enough that neither the Republic Senate nor the Confederacy's leadership would ever officially learn it had existed. Its objective was not destruction, both commanders agreed, recognizing the near-certain futility of that goal against a being who had shrugged off sustained blaster fire and torn a super-battled droid apart with his bare hands. Its objective was leverage, a demonstration of coordinated, overwhelming force sufficient to convince Thanos that unilateral action, however arithmetically sound by his own accounting, carried a cost this galaxy's combined militaries were prepared to impose. Word of the gathering task force reached Thanos through 3 separate channels within the same 2 days. Sella's network, whose intelligence gathering had grown considerably more sophisticated in the weeks since Cassandra, Clan Vet's own scouts, who had picked up unusual fleet movements near the sector's border, and in a development that surprised him more than either of the others, a brief, terse transmission from General Varnell herself, the first direct contact between them since she had walked away from him in the ashes of the refugee camp. "I am not endorsing what's being planned," her message read, stripped of the diplomatic warmth that had characterized their earlier conversations. Asterisk, I want that understood clearly. But I've seen the operational plan, and I've seen the forces being committed, and whatever I think of what you did on Cassandra, I don't believe a joint task force acting outside every chain of command either government actually controls is going to end in anything except more bodies. You should know it's coming. What you do with that knowledge is your own choice to make. Same as it always has been, asterisk. He read the message 3 times, standing alone on the deck of Sella's vessel, and found himself, for the first time since the Coruscant meeting, genuinely uncertain what conclusion his own arithmetic favored. A direct engagement against a joint Republic separatist force, deniable and unsanctioned though it might be, would likely cost lives on both sides. Soldiers he had, since his arrival, made a consistent point of sparing wherever the underlying imbalance did not require otherwise. Withdrawal retreating from the sector entirely and abandoning the fragile network of alliances he had built with Sela and Clan Vet both, offered a cleaner resolution, but one that felt, examined honestly, considerably more like cowardice than the wisdom he tried to tell himself it represented. It was Sela, finding him still standing on the deck an hour after Varnell's transmission arrived, who offered the observation that ultimately shaped his decision. "You keep treating every choice in this galaxy like it's Cassandra all over again," she said, settling against the deck railing beside him with a particular bluntness that had, despite everything Cassandra had cost their partnership, never entirely left her. Big number versus bigger number, arithmetic all the way down. But this isn't a starving world, big man. This is two governments so scared of what you represent that they're breaking their own laws to stop you. That's not a math problem. That's a relationship problem, and I notice you're a lot worse at solving those. What would you have me do then?" Thanos asked, and something in the question, genuine, uncertain, entirely lacking the settled certainty that had characterized every previous conversation between them, seemed to catch Sela's attention in a way his usual composed authority never had. "Talk to them," she said. "Not fight them. Not run from them. Actually talk, the way you talked to that Jedi general on the riverbed, before Cassandra convinced her you weren't worth listening to anymore. You want this galaxy to trust your judgment, big man? Then let it see your judgment, instead of just feeling the aftermath of it. Meet this task force before it's a battle. Show them the thing your vet saw when she watched you fight, discipline, not just capability. It's the only card you haven't played yet, and given how badly the other ones have gone, I'd say it's worth a try." Thanos considered this for a long moment, turning it over against 40,000 years of instinct that had always favored decisive, unilateral action over the uncertain vulnerability of exposing his judgment to others' scrutiny before acting. But something in the weeks since Cassandra, Varnell's fractured trust, Palpatine's uncomfortable accusation, Uravet's hard-won respect earned through demonstrated restraint rather than raw force, had complicated that instinct in ways he was still learning to account for. "I will meet them," he said finally, "unarmed, so far as that word means anything applied to me. I will not fight this task force before it has cause to fight me. Whatever conclusion this galaxy ultimately reaches about my judgment, I would rather it be reached through observation than assumption, even if observation costs me the advantage decisive action would otherwise provide." Sela studied him a moment, something that might have been the first genuine warmth she'd shown him since Cassandra, flickering across her sharp features. "Now that," she said, "sounds like the big man I agreed to partner with in the first place, before 11 million people's worth of arithmetic got in the way." 3 days later, above a contested and otherwise unremarkable system called Braxos Minor, the Joint Republic Separatist Task Force, 6 capital ships, considerable fighter escort, and 2 full battalions of ground forces drawn in equal measure from Dahlon's and Scala's commands, arrived at the coordinates Sela's network had, at Thanos' explicit instruction, quietly leaked to both governments' intelligence services, and found waiting for them not the fortified resistance their operational planning had prepared for, but a single figure standing alone on an empty landing platform, hands open and visibly empty, having chosen, for reasons neither commander yet understood, to meet their overwhelming force with nothing but the same unflinching directness that had characterized every genuine encounter of his 3 months in this galaxy. Admiral Dahlon watched the sensor feed from his flagship's bridge with an unease that had only deepened in the hours since the task force dropped out of hyperspace above Braxos Minor. Every tactical instinct honed across a career in Republic service told him that an adversary who met an overwhelming force alone, unarmed, and without cover was either supremely confident in a capability his intelligence had failed to anticipate, or was attempting something considerably more complicated than the straightforward confrontation his operational plan had been built to handle. Neither possibility offered much comfort. "Commander Scala," he said, opening the joint channel that had, over the preceding 3 days of hurried coordination, become the task force's only functioning chain of command. "Your read on this?" "My read," Scala's modulated voice replied, "is that we came here prepared for a battle, and he appears to have shown up prepared for a conversation. My tactical droids don't have a protocol for that contingency, Admiral. I confess neither do I. They descended together. An unusual, and for both commanders, professionally uncomfortable arrangement. Republic and Separatist officers sharing a single shuttle for the first time in either of their careers, flanked by a mixed honor guard of clone troopers and battle droids that regarded one another with a wariness considerably more habitual than the caution either showed the platform's single occupant. Thanos watched them approach with the same unhurried patience that had characterized every first encounter since his arrival in this galaxy. Hands still open, still visibly empty, though every soldier in the landing party understood, with the particular clarity of people who had studied Cassandra's aftermath in exhaustive tactical detail, exactly how little that emptiness actually meant about the threat he represented. "You did not come to fight," Dahlan said, stepping from the shuttle first, his own hands deliberately loose at his sides though his sidearm remained holstered rather than surrendered. "I confess that complicates my operational plan considerably." "I came to be understood," Thanos said, "before this galaxy decides, through the accumulated weight of rumor and second-hand report, that understanding me is no longer worth attempting. You have assembled 6 capital ships and 2 battalions to contain a single being, Admiral. I would rather you spend that considerable force informed than merely afraid." "Your definition of being understood," Scala said, "included the deaths of a considerable fraction of Cassandra's population. Forgive me if I find the distinction between informed fear and simple fear somewhat academic, given the evidence available to us." "You are correct to hold that against me," Thanos said, and something in the flat, unflinching acknowledgement, offered without the philosophical justification he had extended to Varnell, without the transactional courtship he had rejected from Palpatine, seemed to catch both commanders slightly off guard. "I do not ask you to forgive Cassandra, Commander. I do not entirely forgive it myself, examined honestly in the weeks since. I ask only that you understand it was the choice of a being still learning the actual shape of this galaxy's arithmetic, not a preview of an intention to repeat that choice indiscriminately across every world whose numbers trouble me." Dahlan exchanged a brief, unreadable glance with Scala, a moment of genuine, unplanned coordination between two officers who had spent 6 months trying to kill one another's forces and now found themselves, absurdly, in more immediate professional alignment with each other than with the being standing before them. "Your alliance with the criminal networks in this sector," Dahlan said. "Your partnership with the Mandalorian clan that's been harassing shipping lanes both our governments depend on. Your refusal, according to intelligence neither of our governments can fully corroborate, of an approach from the Confederacy's leadership, and, we believe, the Chancellor's office as well. You have built something in 3 months that neither the Republic nor the Confederacy fully understands, and that both of us are increasingly convinced we cannot afford to leave ungoverned. What would you have us do with that precisely?" It was, Thanos recognized, the most honest question either government had yet posed to him. Not a demand for allegiance, not a philosophical courtship, but a genuine, uncomfortable admission of two institutions confronting the limits of their own authority. He considered his answer with the same careful weight he had given every significant choice since Cassandra, aware that whatever he offered here would likely define this galaxy's understanding of him for whatever remained of his time in it. "I would have you do nothing, Admiral, beyond what you have already begun doing here today," Thanos said. "Talk to me, as you are talking now, rather than assuming a conclusion your intelligence reports have not yet earned. I do not seek governance of this sector, nor conquest of it, nor recruitment into either of your causes. I sought, when I first arrived, a philosophy this galaxy might offer that could survive contact with my own certainty. I have found fragments of one, in a smuggler who taught me that incremental mercy has its own dignity, in a Mandalorian clan that taught me discipline matters as much as capability, in a Jedi general whose trust one broke and have not yet found a way to earn back. I do not yet know what conclusion those fragments add up to. I am not eager to have that conclusion decided for me by 6 capital ships before I have finished the accounting myself." "And if we cannot simply take your word for that," Scala said, "given what your word has already cost once, then I would ask," Thanos said, "that you consider what I have not done in the 3 months since Cassandra, as carefully as you have studied what I did there. I have not repeated it. I have had cause to a dozen smaller crises across this sector, where the old arithmetic would once have offered the same unilateral answer without hesitation. I chose each time the slower and more uncertain path instead. Ask General Varnell if you doubt me. She has watched that restraint as closely as anyone in this galaxy, even as she has not yet forgiven me for the choice that made the restraint necessary to demonstrate. Dahlan studied him for a long moment, weighing, Thanos understood, not merely the words themselves, but the entire improbable, uneasy calculation that had brought a Republic admiral and a Separatist commander to the same landing platform in the first place. I did not come here today expecting to believe you, he said finally. I confess I am somewhat troubled to find myself closer to believing you than my operational briefing accounted for. That, Thanos said, may be the most honest assessment anyone in this galaxy has offered me since my arrival. It was at that precise moment, with Dahlan's cautious, unplanned trust beginning to take a shape that might, given time, have resolved this confrontation without a single shot fired, that the platform's perimeter sensors flared with a warning neither commander's tactical staff had prepared for. A second, considerably larger fleet signature dropping out of hyperspace at the system's edge, bearing neither Republic nor Confederacy transponder codes, moving with a coordinated precision that suggested planning considerably more patient and considerably better resourced than either government's hastily assembled task force. That's not one of ours, Scala said sharply, already keying his comm to query the unfamiliar signature. Nor ours, Dahlan confirmed, his earlier caution hardening instantly back into tactical readiness. Admiral, identify that fleet now. The answer, when it arrived seconds later from the flagship's sensor officer, carried a weight that settled over the landing platform with the particular, sinking finality of a trap only now revealing the full shape of its jaws. Confederacy warships, bearing authorization codes traced directly to Count Dooku's personal command authority, moving in formation that made unmistakably clear they had not come to reinforce Scala's deniable task force. They had come instead with weapons already charging toward a target that included, in the crossfire their approach vector made inevitable, every ship and every soldier, Republic and Separatist alike, currently gathered above Braxos Minor. He's not here to help contain me, Thanos said quietly, understanding arriving with the same cold, immediate clarity that had once let him calculate a civilization's collapse in a single glance. Count Dooku did not come to reinforce your task force, Admiral. He came to eliminate what your task force represents, a Republic and Separatist force cooperating, deniably, outside either government's official sanction. And I suspect, examined honestly, he came to eliminate me as well, while the opportunity of finding me undefended on an open platform presents itself. Dahlan's hand had already moved to his comm, already beginning the frantic sequence of orders that might yet save some fraction of the task force from what was bearing down on them. And in the chaos of the platform's sudden, scrambling readiness, Thanos found himself confronting, with startling clarity, the precise and narrowing shape of the choice this galaxy had finally, inevitably, forced him toward. There was no time for further calculation, and for the first time since his arrival in this galaxy, Thanos found that fact almost a mercy. 3 months of accumulated doubt, of philosophical courtship and betrayed trust and hard-won respect, of turning arithmetic over and over in search of a conclusion that would survive scrutiny. All of it collapsed, in the seconds before Dooku's fleet closed to engagement range, into something simpler and more immediate than philosophy had ever managed to resolve on its own. Soldiers who trusted him enough to stand beside him on an open platform were about to die, and he was, whatever else, remained uncertain about his place in this galaxy, still the only being present capable of doing something about it. Get your people to cover, he told Dahlan, already moving toward the platform's edge, toward the incoming fleet's most direct approach vector. Both of your forces. I will hold what I can hold. Against 6 warships? Scala's modulated voice carried genuine disbelief beneath its usual flat calm. Against exactly as many as I am able to, Thanos said, which has, on every occasion this galaxy has tested it, proven to be considerably more than anyone expects. What followed, in the accounts later compiled by both Republic and Confederacy historians, accounts that would, in the peculiar way of such things, agree far more closely with one another than either government's official war record ever comfortably admitted, was not a battle so much as a demonstration of exactly how far a single being's capability could be stretched before even his considerable strength found its honest limit. Dooku's flagship opened fire within the first minute, capital-grade turbolasers converging on the platform with a force that would have vaporized any conventional target instantly. Thanos met the barrage with his bare hands raised, absorbing what he could not evade, and though the impact staggered him, drove him back across the platform's scarred permacrete in a shower of superheated debris, he did not fall. He held the platform's exposed flank for the 11 minutes it took Dahlon's and Scala's evacuation shuttles to clear the immediate blast radius, taking fire that would have ended a lesser being a dozen times over. And when Dooku's own shuttle finally descended into the chaos, the Count himself, lightsaber ignited, having judged correctly that his fleet's bombardment alone would not settle this particular account. Thanos turned to meet him with a body already bearing the visible cost of the preceding minutes, armor plates scorched and cracked, movements fractionally slower than the effortless economy that had characterized every previous engagement in this galaxy. "You came for the task force," Thanos said, "or you came for me. I confess I no longer particularly care which, Count." "Both in the end," Dooku said, circling with the measured precision of a duelist who had studied, in the months since the riverbed, every scrap of footage and report documenting exactly how this adversary fought. "You refused my offer of partnership, sir. You refused my master's offer as well, I understand, a considerably more generous one than mine, I might add. And yet you found reason to reject it too. A being who refuses every hand extended toward him eventually finds that the galaxy stops extending them and starts, instead, simply removing the inconvenience he represents." "Then remove it," Thanos said, and close the distance between them. The duel that followed lasted less than 90 seconds, and would be remembered, by the handful of witnesses who survived to describe it, as considerably more one-sided than either combatant's reputation might have predicted. Dooku's lightsaber found purchase twice, a shallow cut across Thanos' forearm, a deeper wound along his ribs where a perfectly timed Makashi feint slipped past a guard fractionally slowed by 11 minutes of absorbed cannon fire. But the Count's speed and precision, formidable against any Jedi in the galaxy, proved simply insufficient against a being whose raw strength operated on a scale his blade had never been designed to counter. Thanos caught the lightsaber's blade in his bare palm on the duel's final exchange, the plasma searing deep into flesh that had absorbed capital-grade weapons fire minutes earlier, and used the grip to disarm the Count entirely, the weapon clattering across the platform's ruined permacrete. He did not kill Dooku. He considered it, turned the calculation over in the half-second the Count lay disarmed and exposed before him, the old arithmetic offering its familiar, uncomplicated answer, and found, for reasons he would spend considerable time afterward trying fully to articulate even to himself, that he chose instead to simply render the Count unconscious with a single controlled blow, and turn his attention back to the fleet still bearing down on the evacuating task force. It was General Varnell, arriving in the engagement's final minutes aboard a Jedi cruiser diverted at her own insistence and considerable personal risk from a deployment 3 sectors distant, who found him afterward, still standing amid the platform's wreckage, both hands ruined by the lightsaber's plasma, Dooku's unconscious form at his feet, and the last of Dahlon's and Scala's evacuated forces finally, improbably, clear of the engagement zone. "You held them," she said, disbelief threading through her voice as she surveyed the scorched, cratered ruin of what had been an open landing platform 11 minutes earlier. 6 capital ships, and you held them long enough to get every soldier on that platform to safety. "I did what the arithmetic required," Thanos said, and something in his voice, exhausted in a way she had not previously heard from him, the flat, cold certainty finally, fully spent, carried a weight that told her, more clearly than any words could have, exactly how much the 11 minutes had cost him. "I did not calculate whether it required me to survive doing it. I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did survive regardless." Varnell studied him for a long moment, the fracture that had sat between them since Cassandra still present, still unresolved, but something in it shifting, she understood, in ways that would take considerably longer than this single moment to fully repair. Why? She asked finally. You could have let Dooku's fleet finish what it started. You could have let the task force fall, and it would have solved a problem. One less alliance watching you. One less government suspicious of what you represent. That would have been the old arithmetic's answer, wouldn't it? It would have, Thanos agreed. I did not choose it. Why? She asked again, quieter this time. Thanos looked out across the platform's wreckage toward the distant, retreating shapes of Dooku's remaining fleet, withdrawing now, its commander unconscious, and its purpose here, for the moment, thwarted, and considered the question with the same careful weight he had given every significant reckoning since his arrival in this galaxy. Because a smuggler once told me that everything is a delay if you look at it from far enough away, he said finally. That living well means delaying the bad thing as long as you possibly can, and building something worth delaying it for. I did not fully understand her when she said it. I believe, standing here now, that I finally do. Varnell said nothing for a long moment, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried none of the fury that had defined their last conversation in Cassandra's ashes, only something quieter, more uncertain, the sound of a trust beginning, cautiously, incompletely, to rebuild itself from wreckage neither of them yet knew how to fully account for. That's not the same being who told me 3 months ago that he'd make the hard choice and not apologize for it, she said. No, Thanos agreed, looking down at his ruined hands, at the cost this galaxy had finally fully extracted from a certainty that had survived 40,000 years and 1,000 worlds before arriving here to be, at last, genuinely tested. I do not believe he is. The weeks that followed Braxos Minor unfolded with a strange, uneasy quiet that Thanos had not expected this galaxy capable of offering him. Dooku's failed strike, launched without the Chancellor's official sanction and traced, in the aftermath, to a chain of authorization that led uncomfortably close to Coruscant itself, forced a recalibration in every faction that had spent 3 months trying to determine what he represented. The Republic Senate, briefed on a heavily sanitized version of events, quietly shelved further containment operations, unwilling to authorize open conflict against a being who had, whatever his earlier sins, just spent himself nearly to destruction protecting Republic soldiers from an unsanctioned separatist strike. The Confederacy's Shadow Council, for its part, distanced itself publicly from Dooku's action, though the Count himself, recovering under guard aboard a Republic medical frigate before his eventual quiet transfer back to separatist custody through diplomatic channels neither side wished examined too closely, would never fully explain to his master's satisfaction why the operation had failed so completely against a single unarmed target. Darth Sidious, watching the aftermath unfold from his private chamber above Coruscant's endless traffic, allowed himself no visible reaction beyond a small, considering stillness, the particular patience of a being who understood that a single failed contingency changed a calculation's timeline without changing its ultimate shape. He had wanted, in the end, either an instrument or a martyr, and Thanos, stubbornly, inconveniently, had refused to become either. That refusal would require, Sidious understood, a longer game than he had initially hoped to play, but the war would grind on regardless, and patience, above all else, remained the one resource he had never once found himself lacking. For Thanos himself, the reckoning that mattered most was smaller and considerably more personal than the shifting calculations of Senate and Council alike. He returned to Devron's Reach for the first time in weeks, his hand still bearing the deep scarring the lightsaber's plasma had left behind, a wound that would not fully heal, he suspected, in any time frame short of years, and that he found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, disinclined to regret carrying. He found Sela Vashton exactly where he had first left her, overseeing a shipment at the refinery loading dock, and the conversation that passed between them was shorter than either had perhaps expected, though no less significant for its brevity. "Heard what you did at Braxos," she said, studying his ruined hands with an expression that mixed something like grief with something that might, cautiously, have been the beginning of forgiveness. "Heard you nearly died holding that line." "I did not calculate the odds carefully before choosing to hold it," Thanos admitted. "I find I do not entirely regret the omission." That's new, Sella said. Big man who spent 3 months doing nothing but calculating odds. Deciding the one time it might have actually mattered wasn't worth the math. Perhaps, Thanos said, I have finally begun learning the lesson you tried to teach me before Cassandra ever happened. That some corrections are worth making slowly, imperfectly, at cost to yourself, rather than swiftly and completely at cost to everyone else. Sella studied him a long moment, then extended her hand, the same gesture from their first meeting, absurdly small against his scarred and ruined palm, though this time he shook it properly, carefully, mindful of the wound still healing beneath the gesture. Network's still yours if you want it, she said. Not because I've forgiven Cassandra. I don't know if I ever fully will, and I don't think you'd respect me much if I pretended otherwise. But because I've watched you spend 3 months trying to become someone who wouldn't make that choice again. And that's worth something. That's worth a great deal, actually, in a galaxy this tired of easy answers. General Varnell's reconciliation, when it came, arrived more slowly and with considerably more caution. A series of careful conversations across the following month, conducted at first through formal council channels and gradually, as trust rebuilt itself in small and deliberate increments, through something closer to the genuine dialogue that had characterized their first meeting on the riverbed. The Jedi Council, for its part, remained divided on what to make of him even after Braxos Minor, Master Windu's suspicion never fully abating, Master Yoda's patient curiosity finding, in the weeks that followed, considerable vindication for the caution he had originally urged. Thanos was never offered membership in the Order and never sought it. What he found instead in the fragile, ongoing dialogue with Varnell herself was something he had not expected to value as highly as he came to, not alliance, not recruitment, but simply the slow, difficult work of being understood by someone who had once trusted him, lost that trust to a choice he still could not fully absolve himself of, and chosen, deliberately and at some cost to her own certainty, to extend it again, in smaller and more considered measure. Clan Vet's respect, by contrast, required no such rebuilding. Uravet's assessment of Braxos Minor, delivered in the clipped, economical language characteristic of her people, amounted to a simple observation that the being who held an exposed platform against 6 capital ships to save soldiers who did not belong to his own alliance had, in her judgment, finally answered the question her clan had been quietly debating since Cassandra. Pattern, she told him, when next their paths crossed, matters more than any single choice, big man. Yours has finally started pointing somewhere worth following. He never did recover the gauntlet, nor the stone scattered somewhere in this galaxy's vast dark by the dimensional wound that had first delivered him here, though the fragment recovered from the crater on Deverin's reach remained, sealed in the Jedi Temple's deepest archive vault, a small and patient mystery that would, in time, draw its own attention from forces Thanos had not yet encountered and could not yet anticipate. Whether he searched for the rest in the months and years that followed, whether he found in their absence a permanent liberation from the singular, catastrophic certainty they had once made possible, or whether some fragment of the old philosophy remained banked and waiting, beneath the harder-won wisdom this galaxy had finally taught him. These were questions that would only be answered by the continuing, uncertain shape of whatever came next. What could be said, with confidence, of the being who had fallen through a tear in the sky above Deverin's reach 3 months earlier, was this. He had arrived believing that mercy delayed was cruelty compounded, that only catastrophic correction could answer catastrophic imbalance, and that a lifetime, a very long lifetime, of applying that certainty across 1,000 worlds had earned it the status of unassailable truth. He had tested that certainty against a galaxy already drowning in its own version of the same hard question, and had found, in a smuggler's stubborn incrementalism, in a Mandalorian clan's disciplined restraint, in a Jedi general's fractured and rebuilding trust, evidence sufficient to complicate a conviction that had survived every previous test across 40,000 years without ever once being seriously challenged. He had not abandoned the old arithmetic entirely. Some part of him, honest with itself in the quiet hours, understood that he likely never fully would, that the calculation which had shaped Titan's fate and Cassandra's both remained available to him, waiting, should some future crisis present numbers, too catastrophic for slower correction to answer in time. But he had learned at considerable cost that the choice itself carried a weight he could no longer make lightly unilaterally. Without first exhausting every gentler alternative, this galaxy's strange and stubborn hope for something better might yet offer. The war around him ground on, as wars in this galaxy inevitably did, indifferent to the private reckoning of any single being caught within its machinery. Somewhere above Coruscant, a patient and ancient calculation continued turning toward an endgame that had not yet finished accounting for the singular variable that had refused to serve it. Somewhere in this galaxy's vast dark, 5 stones and a golden gauntlet lay scattered, waiting, their eventual finding a story yet unwritten. And on a modest, unremarkable stretch of the outer rim, a Titan who had once believed himself the only being capable of delivering a galaxy's necessary correction walked instead among smugglers and warriors and reluctant, wary allies, learning, slowly, imperfectly, one small and unglamorous mercy at a time, what it might mean to build a balance worth delaying the ending for. It was not a triumph, in any sense the old arithmetic would have recognized. It was not either a tragedy, no world burned to prove a point, no galaxy reshaped by a single catastrophic gesture. It was something smaller, and in its way, considerably harder won. A philosophy tested against its first genuine challenger in 40,000 years, and found, at last, capable of doubt. 3 months is a short span to measure against a being who had counted his existence in tens of thousands of years, and yet Thanos would come to understand, in the quiet stretches that followed Braxos Minor, that this particular 3 months had reshaped something in him no previous era of his long life had managed to touch. He had crossed into this galaxy armed with a certainty forged in the ashes of his own homeworld, that suffering answered slowly with suffering compounded, that only the decisive, unilateral hand could truly balance a civilization's ledger. He left that certainty, not abandoned but permanently altered, scattered across a sector of the outer rim in the company of a smuggler, a Mandalorian clan, and a Jedi general who had each, in their own stubborn way, refused to let him apply his old mathematics without first answering for what it actually cost. The galaxy itself did not change because of him. The war ground on beyond Devrin's reach and Cassandra and Braxos Minor alike, indifferent to any single being's private reckoning, and would grind on for years, yet before its own catastrophic arithmetic finally resolved itself in ways no one present at this story's telling could have fully anticipated. Palpatine's patient calculation continued turning, undisturbed in its fundamentals, by one refused recruitment, toward an empire that would rise regardless of what a single Titan chose to become in the meantime. Dooku returned to Separatist command chastened but unbroken. His failure at Braxos Minor filed away as a lesson rather than a defeat. The Jedi Order continued fighting a war it had not chosen and had not yet found a path to end. Its council still divided, still stretched thin across 1,000 fronts that mattered more, by any strategic measure, than a single unaligned variable in one unimportant sector. And yet something had shifted in the smaller and more human scale where Thanos had, almost without meaning to, planted himself. Halvo Reach's market stalls stayed stocked. Cassandra, for all the wound it would carry permanently in its memory, did not starve again. Its population, brutally and irreversibly reduced, now sat within the bounds its infrastructure could actually sustain, a mercy so terrible in its method that no one who lived through it could ever call it mercy outright, and yet a stability that held, month after month, in a way the desperate arithmetic of overcapacity never had. Celebashton's network grew into the most reliable humanitarian corridor in the sector, its founders still uncertain, on her most honest days, whether the partnership that built it had been worth what it cost her to forgive. Clan Vet counted the Titan among the very small number of outsiders their warrior code had ever fully claimed as one of their own, not family, not clan, but something adjacent to both, earned through demonstrated discipline rather than blood or oath. And General Varnell, slowly, carefully, rebuilding a trust that Cassandra had shattered in Braxos Minor, had only begun to mend, found herself filing reports to a council that no longer quite knew what category to place him in, neither threat nor ally, neither monster nor hero, but something the galaxy's existing language had no clean word for. Perhaps that, in the end, was the truest thing this story had to offer. That some collisions between worlds do not resolve into triumph or tragedy, into conquest or redemption, but into something messier and more honest than either. A being forced to hold his oldest certainty up against a galaxy's own hard-won, imperfect answers, and found, for the first time in 40,000 years, unable to dismiss what he saw there. He did not become good, in any simple accounting of the word. He did not renounce the arithmetic that had shaped him, nor promise never to reach for it again should some future crisis present numbers too catastrophic for slower correction to answer in time. But he learned, at a cost written permanently into the scarred flesh of his own hands, that the choice itself deserved to be harder than he had ever previously allowed it to be. That a philosophy untested by doubt was not wisdom, but merely habit wearing wisdom's clothing. And that even a titan who had once reshaped half of all existence with a single gesture could still, given a galaxy stubborn enough to insist on it, learn to make room for a slower, smaller, more difficult kind of mercy. Somewhere in the dark between stars, 5 stones, and a golden gauntlet waited to be found, by him or by someone else, or perhaps by no one at all before this galaxy's own long war finally ran its course. Somewhere above Coruscant, a patient and ancient design continued turning toward an ending that had not yet finished accounting for everything a Titan's unexpected arrival had changed along its edges. And on a modest, unremarkable world at the galaxy's rim, a being who had once believed himself the only one capable of delivering necessary correction walked on among the allies his doubt had earned him, carrying forward not certainty, but something he had never expected this galaxy could teach him to value more: the willingness to keep asking the question, rather than believing, ever again, that he already knew the answer for good.